The story of the Vanderlinde Gang is an American tragedy in a cowboy hat, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom preached from horseback and paid for in blood. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s to its shattered remnants in the early 1900s, this outlaw family rides through the last open spaces of the frontier as the living embodiment of a country at war with itself. Because the world was changing, the old ways were dying. Railroads carved lines through untouched valleys, Pinkertons carried the law into places the law had never bothered to go, and civilization arrived with bank ledgers in one hand and a rifle in the other. In that closing window between wilderness and order, Dutch van der Linde built a philosophy, a family, and a dream of permanent escape. On the surface, it sounded noble. Steal from the rich and corrupt. Protect the weak and the lost soul no one else would claim. Live free. Answer to no government, no company, no king. Dutch spoke in sermons around campfires, turning robbery into rebellion and crime into a kind of rough, idealistic justice. In the truest sense, he promised a different America, one where the poor and the outcast could ride beyond the reach of the railroad and simply be. But from the very beginning, that dream rested on a foundation of lies. Some were simple lies to the world, that the gang only hurt those who deserved it, that every killing was necessary, that every bullet fired at a lawman was an act of self-defense. Others were lies to his own family, that each job was safe, that Blackwater would be clean, that St. Denis would be the last big risk before a quiet life in Tahiti or Australia. The most dangerous lies, though, were the ones Dutch told himself. That pride was principle, that vengeance was justice, that Micah's flattery was loyalty while Arthur's doubts were betrayal. Each time he said there was a plan, even when none existed, the distance between his philosophy and his behavior widened, step by step, gunshot by gunshot. How long could that gap stay hidden before it swallowed the gang whole? This is the map of that collapse, traced lie by lie. From the first half-truth he shares with Hosea when two conmen try to rob each other and end up building a family, to the final words he leaves Arthur and John with on the mountainside, every promise marks a point where idealism meets reality, where freedom crashes into civilization, where loyalty curdles into betrayal. Line up every assurance Dutch gives, from Blackwater to Valentine, from Rhodes to St. Denis and the fever dream of Guarma, and a pattern emerges. Each one last score, each vision of mangoes in Tahiti, pushes the gang one step further from what it once claimed to be. Seen together, the two games become a single tragic arc, a slow-motion fall, in which the man, the myth, and the gang he created all come apart under the weight of the lies that held them together. Seen from a distance, those lies can blur together into one long, desperate promise of mangoes and freedom. Up close, they form a trail. Each step marked by a specific moment when Dutch chooses illusion over truth, pride over caution, his own dream over the lives of his so-called family. This is the complete story of those choices. From the very beginning, when he bends the truth to win a partner, to the last time he turns his back on a dying friend in the snow. The time span is vast, and that scope matters. The story moves from its humble beginnings in the 1870s, when Dutch and Hosea cross paths as rival conmen, through the gang's golden years on the frontier, and into the tightening noose of the 1890s, when the world was changing faster than Dutch could accept. From dusty backroads and crooked riverboats to Blackwater's ferry, St. Denis boulevards, the feverish nightmare of Guarma, and the frozen mountaintop where everything ends, each era will be traced through the lies that define it. The focus is not just on what happens, but why he lies when he does. Every time Dutch promises safety, every time he invokes family, every time he swears this is the one last score that will buy their freedom, the words land differently on Arthur, Hosea, John, and the others. For Arthur, those promises are a philosophy, the only way he knows how to exist in a world that keeps closing in. For Hosea, they are a fading, idealistic echo of the man he helped create. For John, they become a chain he has to break. What changes in Dutch's mind when those same words turn from inspiration into manipulation? To make sense of that transformation, the story unfolds in mini-arcs around key eras and heists. Blackwater, wear it clean. Easy ferry job becomes a bloodbath Dutch should have seen coming. Valentine and Horseshoe Overlook, where talk of codes and honor hides growing recklessness. Rhodes and the Braithwaite feud, where a promise of control ends with Sean dead, Jack stolen. St. Denis, where Dutch insists there is still a plan even as Hosea and Lenny die on the steps of a bank. Guarma and Beaver Hollow, where his trust in Micah, the living embodiment of his worst impulses, deepens with every lie about loyalty and betrayal. All of it is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of an outlaw family trying to outrun civilization while the old ways were dying. Each section will anchor itself in the exact words Dutch uses, the lie he tells in that moment, and the fallout that follows. Who believes, who doubts, who pays? Which promise finally snaps Arthur's faith? Which half-truth pushes John to walk away? By lining them up in order, Dutch's sanity and morality can be watched crumbling, lie by lie. And it all begins smaller than the end would suggest. Not with a massacre on a ferry or a shootout in a marble bank, but with a joke shared between two conmen, a simple scheme to rob the same mark, and a man who truly believes he can outsmart the world. From that quiet confidence to the echoing gunshots on a snowy ridge, the path is straighter than it seems. The story begins, in the truest sense, on a quiet street with one wealthy fool and two hungry men who both believe they are the cleverest outlaw in the world. It is the 1870s, the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. Railroads are carving through the frontier, banks are swallowing small towns, and a certain kind of man feels civilization closing in on his freedom. Dutch Vanderlinde and Hosea Matthews have never met, but on this night they are drawn to the same mark. A portly businessman, drunk on imported wine and his own importance, weighed down by jewelry and confidence. Dutch gets there first. He leans against a lamppost, hat tip just so, rehearsing a story of bandits in the next county, of a nearby friend who can keep the man safe for a modest fee. Hosea watches from the shadows, already planning to be that friend, already composing his own lie about dangerous roads and trustworthy escorts. Two predators, one sheep. It should be simple. It is not. Dutch intercepts the man with theatrical concern, all sweeping gestures and grand philosophy about how a man must protect his family in such dangerous times. Hosea steps in half a minute later, pretending to be a passing traveler, quietly warning that some smooth-tongued stranger has been fleecing people in the area. For a moment, both cons run at once, their lies tangling in the air. Then the businessman, confused and offended, storms away untouched. Silence. Two men remain in the street, hands hovering near their guns, eyes measuring distance and intent. Dutch gives a name that is not his, wrapped in tales of past exploits that are larger than life, robberies against corrupt rail barons and heroic stands against lawmen who served only the rich. Hosea offers a different false name and a half-true backstory, trimming away his own ruthlessness, softening his edges into something almost respectable. Each is already curating an image, testing how far the other can be led. The tension should lead to blood. Instead, it leads to laughter. Hosea catches the rhythm of Dutch's exaggerations and quietly points out a detail that does not quite fit. Dutch, in turn, notices the way Hosea's eyes never stop scanning, the way his hand never drifts far from the pistol under his coat. In that instant, both men recognize a reflection, a conman who believes in something more than money, and a thief who can see through masks, including Dutch's. Dutch is charismatic, theatrical, almost the living embodiment of his own philosophy. He speaks of freedom, of resisting a rigged civilization, of creating a family bound by loyalty instead of law. Hosea is dry, observant, and quietly dangerous, a man who listens more than he talks and files every detail away. He hears Dutch's ideals, hears the lies threaded through them, and chooses not to call them out. Not yet. From its humble beginnings, this is a partnership built on shared dreams and mutual deception. They agree to work together on the next score, promising each other honesty while both silently resolve to keep a few truths in reserve. Why kill a kindred spirit when both can be richer, smarter, more powerful together? As they walk off into the dark, planning that first real scam as partners, neither realizes that the small lies told on this street will echo through every campfire, every one last job, every promise of paradise to come. And the next person Dutch decides to impress with his story of the world will not be a stranger, but a boy destined to watch those lies fall apart. The next chapter in their story does not begin with a gunfight or a hanging. It begins with a campfire, a boy, and a promise. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang is imagined by Dutch as more than a pack of thieves. In his telling, it is a philosophy on horseback. He speaks of freedom from a corrupt system, of a world where men and women are not crushed by bankers, railroads, and politicians who never dirtied their hands. The law is not justice, he insists. It is only the weapon of the powerful. So the gang will live by its own code instead, a chosen family bound by loyalty, not by the rules of civilization. Arthur Morgan hears this from the very beginning. To a boy already half feral, Dutch's words are salvation. Dutch promises to protect the weak, to stand up for those the world has forgotten, to make sure that no one in camp ever goes hungry or faces a noose alone. In the truest sense, he casts the gang as the living embodiment of resistance, an outlaw commune riding against the tide of progress. Proof that the old ways were dying, but not yet dead. Hosea, standing beside him, believes in that dream, but he understands the cost more clearly. Where Dutch paints in grand speeches, Hosea sketches in details, which banks are lightly guarded, which towns can be worked without a shot fired, which marks can be conned instead of killed. He is the pragmatic counterweight, always nudging Dutch away from bloodshed, reminding him that a dead sheriff brings Pinkertons, and Pinkertons bring the end. For Hosea, survival is the real revolution. Around their fires, the gang becomes a utopian experiment, part family, part camp meeting, part political statement. They share food, raise children not their own, and pass the bottle while Dutch turns every robbery into a story of justice. A train job is not theft, it is reclaiming wealth stolen by industrial barons. A rustled herd is not greed, it is payment for a world that left them behind. Who could argue when the speeches are this good? Yet even in these early years, the contradictions creep in. Dutch condemns the rich and powerful, yet the gang's saddlebags fill with cash from small-town banks and frightened storekeepers. He preaches nonviolence when possible, yet his eyes light up at the thought of a glorious last stand, a bloody showdown that will prove their courage to history. Is this freedom, or just another man chasing his own reflection? Over time, the stories themselves begin to repeat. Dutch tells the same tales of noble outlaws and corrupt civilization, the same promises of one last score before they disappear to some imagined paradise. He refines them, polishes them, performs them. The line between belief and performance blurs, even for him. And as the gang grows, those campfire speeches will become both the glue that holds them together and the first echo of the lies that will tear them apart. From the very beginning, Dutch understands that guns and horses are not his sharpest weapons, words are. Before the gang ever robs a bank in Valentine or a trolley station in Saint Denis, he lays down the first and most important lie: they are not common criminals. They are the good kind of outlaws. In Dutch's telling, every robbery is a moral act. They steal from railroads, banks, and rich men with soft hands, men who profit from the same civilization he calls rotten. They do not hurt innocents, he insists. They do not kill for pleasure or for profit alone. Their crimes are framed as a story of resistance, of freedom reclaimed from a corrupt world that has forgotten honor. In the truest sense, he casts the gang as folk heroes pushed to the margins because the world was changing and the old ways were dying. From its humble beginnings, this philosophy is intoxicating. When Arthur rides down on a coach, when John pulls a gun in a smoky saloon, they are not just thieves. They are, in Dutch's words, the living embodiment of a higher cause. The lawmen chasing them are not guardians of order but hired guns for the rich. Every bullet fired at a Pinkerton becomes an act of self-defense. Every emptied safe a blow against an unjust system. Who would not want to believe that? But reality keeps intruding. A guard panics during a robbery and is shot. A bank teller in Valentine trembles as Bill shouts in his face. A civilian is trampled in the chaos after a job goes wrong. In Rhodes, the bloodbath between the Braithwaites and the Greys leaves bodies in the street who never chose a side. Each time, Dutch either looks away or folds the collateral damage into his rhetoric. These are necessary sacrifices. These are tragic outcomes forced on them by a hostile civilization. The story never changes, only the excuses grow longer. For Arthur, for John, for the misfits gathered around those campfires, that lie becomes a comfort blanket. It allows them to ride past burned wagons and frightened townsfolk and still tell themselves they are better than O'Driscolls, better than bounty hunters, better than the Pinkertons. Even when the gang hangs an innocent man on Micah's word, or when Dutch drowns Angelo Bronte in cold blood after promising restraint, Many cling to the idea that their hands are cleaner. If they are the good outlaws, then every horror can be forgiven, can it not? Dutch leans into this more as pressure mounts. He paints the gang as victims, not predators, victims of industrialists like Cornwall, victims of government agents, victims of a country that has no place for free men. Each setback is proof that the world is against them, each escalation in violence a justified response. As his plans grow more reckless, his speeches grow more grand, insisting that one last score will buy back safety, buy back family, buy back the dreams they started with. And once that first lie is swallowed, that their outlaw life is righteous, every other lie becomes easier. Easier to tell, easier to believe. Lies about Tahiti, about safety, about loyalty, lies that will carry them from Blackwater to Beaver Hollow, until even the truest believers are forced to ask, what if they were never the good kind of outlaws at all? But for those lies to work, Dutch needed proof. Not speeches, not theories, but a living, breathing example that his philosophy could take a broken life and turn it into something noble. That proof arrived in the form of a half-starved teenager with a stolen watch in his pocket and a chip on his shoulder big as the frontier. Arthur Morgan's story begins before the gang, before the big scores, before the grand talk of Tahiti. From its humble beginnings, it is a story of absence. His mother dies when he is still a boy. His father, Lyle Morgan, is a petty criminal drifting through a world that has no patience for small-time outlaws. There is no stable home, no real schooling, only campfires, cheap whiskey, and the constant lesson that the law is something that happens to other people until the day it finally happens to him. Lyle is arrested, hauled away in irons, and the boy is left behind. No inheritance, no guidance, only anger, hunger, and a talent for trouble. In the truest sense, Arthur becomes the kind of stray the new America is happy to grind down, too wild for honest work, too proud to beg, and already known to the local sheriffs. The old ways were dying, but no one told the children left standing in the dust. So by his early teens, Arthur is stealing to eat, robbing travelers, drifting through towns where the train tracks and telegraph wires announce that civilization is coming whether he likes it or not. One night, he picks the wrong mark. Or the right one, depending on how the story is told. He tries to rob a pair of well-dressed strangers who, by a small irony, are in town to run their own con. Two thieves, each thinking the other is an easy target. Those strangers are Dutch Vanderlinde and Hosea Matthews. From the very beginning, they see more than a clumsy mugger. They see a lost soul on the verge of disappearing into prison or an unmarked grave. Dutch talks his way out of the confrontation, turns it into a conversation, then an invitation. Jail, death, or something else entirely. A family of outlaws with a cause. What follows is a dual apprenticeship. Dutch takes Arthur under his wing as a son, teaching him to read, to quote books, to believe that their crimes are a form of resistance. Freedom, Dutch insists, is their birthright, and the world is rigged against men with the courage to seize it. Hosea, quieter but no less important, teaches Arthur how to track, how to hunt, how to listen, how to survive when the speeches run out. Together, they shape him into the living embodiment of Dutch's dream, a loyal, principled outlaw who robs banks and stagecoaches yet still believes he is better than the men in suits behind the desks. If Arthur can be remade, does that not prove Dutch's philosophy? Every time Arthur follows an order, every time he risks his life without question, Dutch's confidence grows. The lies start to feel less like lies and more like necessary guidance. In those early years, Arthur believes. He believes they are different. He believes there is a plan. He believes every risk, every bullet, every lie told to the outside world is in service of something bigger than himself. The question that will haunt him later has not yet taken shape. What happens when the man who saved him starts to believe his own lies more than he believes his own son? Dutch understands something about Arthur that Arthur does not yet understand about himself. His past is a wound, and a wound can be pressed. From the very beginning, Dutch does not just offer shelter and food and work. He offers a story of who Arthur is and what his suffering means. Arthur's father dies in chains, dragged away by the law and locked up until disease and neglect finish what the courts began. To most of the world, that would be a cautionary tale about crime and consequence, a warning that the old ways were dying and that outlaw blood only leads to the noose. Dutch tells it differently. In Dutch's retelling, Lyle Morgan is not a petty criminal. He is a victim of a corrupt civilization that punishes the poor and protects the rich. The law is not justice. The law is the enemy. This is not just comfort, it is philosophy. Dutch sits by the fire, voice low and hypnotic, and turns Arthur's childhood shame into proof that the world was changing in all the wrong ways. The Pinkertons, the judges, the deputies who dragged Lyle away become symbols of a system that can never be trusted. If the law stole Arthur's father, then Arthur owes the law nothing. In the truest sense, Dutch rewrites grief into permission. From there, the flattery begins. Dutch tells Arthur he is better than the world that spat him out, better than the farmers who clutched their coins, better than the men in suits who never lifted a finger for a hungry boy. You are my best man, Dutch insists, again and again. Praise becomes a chain. Arthur's worth is measured not by his own conscience, but by Dutch's approval and Dutch's grand designs. Over the years, Dutch carefully edits their shared history. He dwells on the night he pulled a starving teenager out of a jail wagon. He reminds Arthur of the first big score they rode together, the shootouts survived, the winters endured. He does not dwell on the botched robberies, the civilians caught in crossfire, the moments Hosea had to pull him back from the edge. Every hardship becomes evidence that his way is the only way, that freedom demands sacrifice, that family demands obedience. The pattern is subtle, but its effects are not. Arthur begins to speak in Dutch's cadences, to repeat Dutch's lines about the real criminals wearing badges and top hats. He defends Dutch to John, to Hosea, to anyone who questions the plan. Violence becomes necessary, loyalty becomes principle, running becomes living free. His own doubts are drowned out by a borrowed voice. Here lies the quiet tragedy. The first meaningful lie Dutch tells is not to the law, or to the gang as a whole. It is to Arthur. By reshaping Arthur's past, Dutch takes hold of his future. Controlling the story means controlling the man, and that control will matter when the plans grow darker, the enemies closer, and the dream of freedom begins to curdle into something far more dangerous. Dutch's first great project is Arthur. His second is John. If Arthur is the son Dutch chooses to shape from the very beginning, John Marston arrives as something harsher, more jagged, a story of survival without guidance. John's childhood is not just poor or lonely, it is brutal. Orphaned young, shuffled through in different hands, he ends up in an orphanage where discipline means beatings and affection is a rumor. The old ways were dying, but what replaced them was not kindness. It was bureaucracy and neglect. John runs. He runs from the belt, from the shouted orders, from the cold beds and colder stairs. Out on the road he starves. He steals bread, then coats, then whatever his shaking hands can grab. He sleeps in ditches and abandoned barns, half wild and half frozen, an outlaw in the truest sense long before the word ever reaches his ears. Where Arthur had a father, however flawed, John has only hunger and fists. The result is a boy who trusts nothing, believes no one, and expects betrayal as the natural order of the world. When Dutch and Hosea cross his path, John is already dangerous. He can fight, he can run, he can vanish into the trees. Dutch does not just see a thief. He sees another lost soul to save, another chance to prove that his philosophy can redeem anyone. From its humble beginnings, this is Dutch's pattern. Find the broken, call it family, then bind it to him with a vision of freedom and purpose. He repeats the ritual almost word for word. He gives John the same speeches about civilization closing in, the same promises that their gang is different, that their crimes are aimed upward at a corrupt world. He offers food, protection, a place by the fire. But where Arthur had leaned forward, eager to please, John leans back. He listens, yet his eyes narrow. He hears Dutch's stories about loyalty and destiny, but he also hears the parts that do not quite add up. This contrast matters. Arthur becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's idealistic dream, obedient, devoted, quick to accept Dutch's explanations for every risk and every corpse. John is something else. He is grateful, but guarded. He questions why they hit one town instead of another, why a simple job leaves bodies in the street, why Dutch's anger flares so quickly when pride is wounded. Dutch admires the boy's toughness, his refusal to break under pressure. At the same time, that resistance irritates him, a splinter he cannot quite pull free. Here, the seeds of a long tension are planted, favored son and black sheep, both orbiting the same sun. The same lies about family, about loyalty, about one last job leading to a paradise somewhere far away, fall on two different hearts. Arthur absorbs them. John files them away. When the world was changing and Dutch's plans grow more desperate, that difference in how they heard the same words will decide who clings to the dream and who walks away from it. And Dutch, for all his certainty, has no idea yet which of his sons will believe him when it matters most. That difference turns into a quiet fault line long before anyone hears it crack. On the surface, Arthur and John grow up as brothers in arms. Underneath, Dutch is already teaching them to believe in two different worlds. From its humble beginnings, their bond is forged in mud, hunger, and gunsmoke. The early years are full of long rides where the cold bites through worn coats and the only warmth comes from shared jokes. Arthur mocks John's stubborn streak. John fires back about Arthur being Dutch's golden boy, and both men know, in the truest sense, that Dutch and Hosea saved them from being just another lost soul hanged in some nameless town. Around the campfire, they pass bottles, trade scars, and listen to Dutch spin the gang's story as a family standing against a corrupt civilization. Yet even in those peaceful moments, the split is there. Arthur leans in when Dutch speaks, repeating his words later as if they were scripture, honor, freedom, destiny. He tells John that they are the living embodiment of a better outlaw, that their robberies are a blow against a rigged system. John listens, but his eyes drift to the food pot, to the ammunition box, to the thin pile of coin. For him, the question is simpler. Will this keep the gang alive through the next winter? Or will it get them all killed? Dutch sees this, and he uses it. When Arthur rides with him, Dutch praises his loyalty and belief, telling him he is the one who truly understands the philosophy, the one who will carry the dream when the old ways were dying. When John questions a plan, Dutch's tone shifts. He calls it ingratitude, reminds John of being pulled half-frozen from the snow, of Abigail, of Jack. Doubt becomes selfishness, and selfishness becomes betrayal waiting to happen. Over time, Dutch starts telling each man a slightly different version of the same promise. To Arthur, he swears that one last job will prove the world wrong and let the gang ride free, that Tahiti or Australia will be their reward for faith. To John, he insists those same jobs are necessary just to get clear, to buy a small ranch, to give Jack the quiet life Dutch claims he never had. The lie is the same. Salvation is always one score away, but the angle changes depending on who is listening. There are smaller stories, too. A botched robbery becomes a tale of noble resistance when Arthur is present, a warning about what happens when people hesitate when John is in earshot. A dead witness is called unfortunate when Arthur asks, unavoidable when John does. How long can two men ride side by side when the man they trust most is whispering different truths into each ear? That tension between believer and skeptic does not explode overnight. It simmers through Blackwater, through Valentine, through Rhodes and Saint Denis, as the world was changing and Dutch's plans grow darker. And when the biggest lies finally shatter, Arthur and John will find themselves staring at Dutch from opposite sides of that old invisible line. Only then will it become clear which son Dutch has truly been preparing to lose. Dutch's lies do not begin with Blackwater or Saint Denis. They begin here, in the quiet years when the campfire is small, the faces are new, and every desperate stranger is told the same comforting story of freedom, family, and a future just over the next horizon. From its humble beginnings, the gang grows one stray at a time. Bill Williamson comes first in this chapter of expansion, a former soldier thrown out of the army, drunk, violent, and humiliated. He is on the verge of being lynched after a bar fight that leaves a man bleeding in the street when Dutch steps through the crowd, voice calm, eyes blazing. Dutch talks the mob down, blames the law, blames the railroad, blames a broken civilization that turns men into beasts, then punishes them for it. By the end of the night, Bill is not a failure. He is a recruit. The pattern repeats with almost ritual precision. Javier Escuella, the Mexican outlaw and revolutionary, is found half-starved and hunted along the border, Pinkertons and Rurales both eager to claim his head. Dutch and Hosea cut him loose from a noose in waiting, guns drawn, words flowing. Dutch calls him a fighter, a man of principle, a living embodiment of resistance. Hosea, quieter, presses food into his hands and shows him where to run. In the truest sense, Javier does not just escape death. He steps into a philosophy. Others follow. Charles Smith, wounded and drifting between worlds, finds a place at their fire. A widowed woman named Sadie Adler is pulled from the smoking ruins of her home years later. But the template is already there. Dutch finds people when they are starving, hunted, alone, and tells them they are not broken. The world is. Who could resist that when everything has been taken? Dutch's central pitch hardly changes from the very beginning. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the law had become nothing more than hired guns for the rich. Ride with him, he promises, and an outlaw can be free, can be truly seen, can belong to a family that answers to no one. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, sold as gospel around every campfire. Yet while Dutch makes the speeches, Hosea makes it function. He teaches Bill how to hold a rifle steady instead of waving it in rage, shows Javier how to scout a town, not just charge it. He walks Arthur and the newer boys through cons that leave everyone alive, robberies that hit express offices and stagecoaches rather than poor farmers, escape routes that avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Dutch talks about freedom. Hosea plans how to live long enough to enjoy it. Even here, though, the cracks exist. Dutch promises safety he cannot guarantee, swears he has a plan for a ranch in West Elizabeth, for land in New Austin, for disappearing to some distant shore he has never seen. Each newcomer hears that the danger is temporary, that one last score will buy a future no one has actually mapped beyond the next camp. Is it a lie if the liar believes it, or is this the moment where Dutch begins to confuse his own rhetoric with reality, convincing himself that the gang's growing size is proof the philosophy works, not proof that the danger is mounting? Those questions will matter when the noose tightens, when the faces around the fire are too many to protect, and when one last job stops sounding like a promise and starts sounding like a curse. For a while, the curse sounded blessed. The gang entered its golden years, and for those on the inside, it felt less like a criminal enterprise and more like a story of destiny finally taking shape. They moved like migrating wolves across the frontier, rotating camps through pine forests, snow-choked ridges, and quiet river valleys. One season might find them high in the grizzlies, tents half buried in frost, horses steaming in the dawn. Another would be spent beneath cottonwoods and fireflies, the air thick with laughter, guitar strings, and the smell of stew. From its humble beginnings as two conmen running small swindles, the Vanderlinde Gang had become something larger, the living embodiment of an outlaw family chasing freedom on its own terms. The jobs reflected that momentum. Stagecoaches tipped on lonely roads after careful scouting, banks in small towns relieved of their cash with almost theatrical precision, trains halted in the dark by lantern signals and explosives placed exactly where Hosea said they should go. Dutch stood at the center of it all, cloak swirling, voice rising before each score. He called them operations, not robberies, and framed every risk as part of a campaign against a corrupt civilization that had no place for people like them. Before a heist, he would stand by the fire or atop a wagon, painting pictures in the air. This wasn't just about money. It was about striking back, about feeding the women and children, about buying one more season of freedom before the world closed in. Afterward, when someone came back bleeding or a partner did not come back at all, Dutch was there too, hand on a shoulder, words soft and solemn. The pain, he said, proved the cause was real. Sacrifice meant the dream mattered. In time, the gang began to repeat his language until it became their own. Around the camp, stories of robberies turned into legends, with Dutch cast as strategist, philosopher, and savior in the truest sense. They told each other that they only took from the rich, that every town they robbed was already rotten, that every shot fired was forced upon them. Even those who knew better, men like Hosea and Arthur, found comfort in the myth. What was easier, to see a life of crime or to see a crusade? But beyond the campfires, the world was changing. Railroads carved steel lines across the plains, telegraph wires carried news faster than any horse, and the Pinkertons learned to match faces to names, habits to patterns. The old ways were dying, and the same daring train robbery that once vanished into wilderness now left a trail of witnesses, reports, and wanted posters. Dutch insisted it did not matter. The gang was mobile, he said, smarter than the law, always one step ahead. One more big score, one more move west, and they would be beyond the reach of civilization. Yet the jobs crept closer to populated towns, the guards came better armed, and the Pinkertons arrived quicker each time. Victories still came, but they came with heavier gunfire and longer casualty lists. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Dutch's confidence shifted. His speeches grew grander, his explanations more elaborate, his promises of safety more absolute even as safety slipped away. Was this strategy, or the first tremor of delusion? Around the fire, some still cheered without question, while others stared into the flames a little longer, wondering how long a dream could outrun a world determined to wake it up. That was the moment Dutch's favorite story truly took shape. When confidence began to wobble, when the world was changing faster than his plans could keep up. He reached for a simple phrase that could silence doubt and rekindle belief. One last job. 3 small words that sounded less like a scheme and more like salvation. From its humble beginnings, that promise was almost innocent. In the early, relatively good years, when campfires were loud with laughter and the Pinkertons felt distant, Dutch would lean back after a successful robbery and paint a picture of the future. One day, he would say, they would head west, far beyond the reach of civilization, find a place where an outlaw could breathe and a family could live in peace. No maps, no timelines, just a hazy horizon where all this danger would finally mean something. At first, it was a story of comfort more than commitment. The gang was young, the money was flowing, and the risks felt manageable. Arthur was still idealistic, John still eager to prove himself, and Dutch's philosophy still sounded noble rather than desperate. One last score was a campfire refrain, a way to end an argument or soothe a frightened heart. Why worry about the next robbery, when it was all in service of the last one that would set everyone free? But as the years passed and the old ways were dying, that vague dream hardened into specific destinations. Dutch started naming places with the certainty of a preacher reciting scripture. First it was simply West, then Mexico, then Australia, and finally Tahiti, a tropical Eden where mangoes grew on trees and the law could never reach. Each setback demanded a clearer promise. Each failure required a brighter fantasy. The more the world closed in, the more detailed the escape became. The lie worked because it did everything at once. It offered hope to people who had lost almost everything, turned present danger into a necessary sacrifice, and transformed every question about risk into an accusation of disloyalty. Who wanted to be the one to say no to freedom? Who wanted to admit that the dream might be delusions dressed up as destiny? To doubt the next one last job was, in the truest sense, to doubt Dutch himself. Hosea saw the trap earlier than most. In front of the gang, he played along, nodding at talk of islands and orchards, cracking dry jokes about learning to farm or run a hotel. In private, his tone was different. He wondered whether Dutch actually knew when to stop, or whether the chase had become the only place he felt alive. To Hosea, Dutch was the living embodiment of a man who preached freedom while chaining himself to his own legend. Over time, the phrase curdled. One last score stopped sounding like a promise and started to echo like a warning, though almost no one recognized it. Each repetition carried more blood, more graves, more betrayal. By the time the gang understood that this refrain was not a path out but a spiral down, that last job had already dragged them past the point of no return. That spiral down found its center in Blackwater. If Dutch's promise of one last score had become a curse, the ferry job was the moment that curse took flesh, the living embodiment of every dream and every delusion he had ever sold to his family. On paper, it sounded perfect. A government ferry, heavy with cash and bonds, due to pass through the booming town of Blackwater under cover of routine. Dutch framed it as a clean, quick robbery in a civilized place that thought itself safe. No banks to blow, no trains to chase, no ranchers to terrorize, just a soft, rich target that would finally give them the money to disappear. Tahiti, Australia, going further west where the world was changing more slowly, he dangled all of it. This, he said, was the job that would let them step away from civilization on their own terms. From the very beginning, though, the edges did not fit. Blackwater was not some forgotten frontier town. It was a symbol of the new order, a polished harbor where the old ways were dying under clean streets and telegraph wires. There were more deputies on the corners, more Pinkerton agents asking quiet questions, more nervous glances whenever outlaws passed through. Hosea felt it in his bones. He had watched the pattern for decades, and every instinct told him this was not a story of freedom, but of a trap being baited. He said so, calmly, repeatedly, almost pleading without raising his voice. The law was thick in Blackwater. The ferry schedule was too public. The Pinkertons had already been sniffing around their operations. Dutch brushed it away with that familiar, confident smile. The law, he insisted, was slow and stupid. They had outsmarted worse before. Had they not robbed trains, banks, and magnates who thought themselves untouchable? Was this not, in the truest sense, what their philosophy demanded? A strike against the very heart of the system that wanted them gone? Arthur listened, torn between Hosea's caution and Dutch's certainty. His loyalty was not blind, but it was deep, forged from its humble beginnings when Dutch had taken in a lost soul and given him a place in the world. John was more openly skeptical, pointing out the Pinkertons, the town's growth, the way Blackwater felt watched. Yet he still went along, pulled by habit, by pride, by the promise that this time the plan would actually end the running. Around them, the younger members, Javier, Bill, the newer faces, heard only the numbers. A ferry full of money, a future bought in one night. Dutch framed every risk as proof of destiny. Danger meant importance, attention meant impact, and hesitation meant cowardice. He told them he had contingencies, routes, allies, an exit for every scenario. He told them he had a plan. Then he led them toward Blackwater, under lantern light and gathering clouds, repeating those same assurances. But for the first time, something in his voice did not quite ring true. It sounded less like a strategy, and more like a man trying to convince himself that the world had not already moved past him. The ferry waited. The law watched. And Dutch walked straight into town, still promising that this would be the last job, still swearing that nothing could go wrong, as the noose quietly tightened around them. Unseen, but inevitable. It went wrong fast. Not with a dramatic speech or a noble last stand, but with the ugly crack of rifles in the dark, and the sudden realization that Dutch's sure thing was a death trap. The Blackwater ferry job was supposed to be a clean robbery, a story of precision and control. Dutch had promised an easy score, quick boarding, terrified rich passengers, a fortune in bonds, and a quiet escape before civilization even knew what had happened. Instead, the gang stepped into a world already waiting for them. Lawmen were in position, Pinkertons watching from the shadows, and nervous guards on the ferry had their fingers already resting on triggers. When the gang moved, the ferry exploded into chaos. Gunfire tore through the night. Civilians screamed and dropped where they stood, or threw themselves over railings into the black water below. The gang's idealistic fantasy of a bloodless haul shattered in seconds as bullets punched through windows, luggage, and flesh. Arthur, John, Javier, Bill all found themselves pinned down, trading shots with unseen enemies, fighting for survival rather than profit. The old ways were dying, and Blackwater proved it with every muzzle flash. In that moment, Dutch's leadership faced its harshest test. A cautious man might have called a retreat, cut losses, and dragged whoever he could off that boat. Dutch did the opposite. Under pressure, he doubled down. He shouted for the gang to push forward, to grab what they could, to trust his plan even as it bled out on the deck. He had sworn this was safe, that the law would be slow, that the world was changing in their favor. Confronted with the truth, he chose delusion over adjustment. The price was immediate. Some gang members never made it off the ferry. Others vanished in the smoke and confusion, dead or scattered. The law, already enraged by the bodies on the boat, now had a massacre to avenge. Pinkertons, who had been circling the Vanderlinde Gang for years, were suddenly fully mobilized, treating Dutch not as a clever outlaw philosopher, but as a public enemy. The survivors fled into the mountains with almost nothing, dragging their wounded and their grief up into the snow, leaving most of the money behind. From its humble beginnings, this family had survived on daring and luck. That night, both ran dry. For Arthur and Hosea, something fundamental shifted. From the very beginning, Dutch's confidence had been the living embodiment of their faith in the gang, a shield against doubt. In Blackwater, that shield cracked. They had seen him be wrong before, now they saw him be catastrophically wrong, and then refused to admit it. When questioned, Dutch called it bad luck, treachery, the cruelty of civilization. Never bad planning, never his own pride. And yet, even as they shivered in the colder snow, hunted and half-starved, Dutch's voice carried the same refrain. He had a plan. He always had a plan. But from Blackwater onward, those words sounded less like leadership and more like a man clinging to his own myth, insisting the dream still lived, while the gang quietly wondered who, exactly, they were following into the dark. In that frozen silence after Blackwater, with the snow swallowing sound and breath, Dutch made a choice even more dangerous than the ferry itself. He decided the disaster was not his fault, not his miscalculation, not his arrogance. It was betrayal, or bad information, or the cruel hand of fate. Anything but the man who had led them onto that boat in the first place. From the very beginning of the Coulter exile, his voice cut through the blizzard with the same old confidence. He told the gang the job had been sound, the plan had been solid, the philosophy still pure. The problem, he insisted, was that someone had talked, or that the Pinkertons had been unnaturally quick, or that the world was changing faster than any honest outlaw could predict. The old ways were dying, he said, and Blackwater was proof. But his own role in that death? That part went unspoken. Around the campfire, he framed Blackwater as a near miracle turned tragedy at the last second. They were this close. The money was still out there, waiting in a lockbox or hidden hold, a phantom fortune that could yet buy their freedom. The ferry had not been a mistake. It had been a vision interrupted, a story of dreams stolen by civilization and its mercenaries. In the truest sense, he turned a massacre into a myth. To sustain that myth, Dutch began his first great cover-up. He avoided specifics, gliding past details that did not fit. Who warned him about the extra guards? Why had he pushed forward when Hosea hesitated? How had the Pinkertons arrived so quickly, guns already drawn? When questions drifted too close to those moments on the docks, his temper flared, or his voice softened into wounded disappointment, accusing the doubter of losing faith. Was this what their family had come to? He would ask. Suspicion instead of loyalty? Most of the gang accepted the story because they needed to. They were cold, hunted, and terrified, clinging to Dutch as the living embodiment of a future beyond the noose. But Arthur and Hosea listened differently. They shared quiet looks when Dutch repeated that the plan had been perfect. They asked gentle questions, testing the edges of his tale. Had the informant really said it would be that easy? Had Dutch mentioned all the risks beforehand? Why did his memory of the shootout never quite match the gunfire still echoing in their heads? Bit by bit, they noticed a pattern. Details shifted, motivations blurred. Dutch's certainty grew even as the facts thinned out beneath it. This was no simple attempt to spare the gang's feelings. It was a man revising reality to protect his own reflection. Blackwater stopped being a botched robbery and became something more insidious. The moment Dutch learned he could lie about the past, reshape the present, and still keep most of his family believing. And once that door opened, how far would he walk through it? Once that door opened, something else walked through it. Not just Dutch's ego, not just his wounded pride, but a man perfectly suited to live inside those lies. Micah Bell. From the very beginning of Micah's time with the gang, he stood apart. Where Hosea was measured and Arthur was conflicted, Micah was ruthless, opportunistic, and hungry. He had no interest in Dutch's philosophy except as a tool, no patience for the gang's fragile sense of family unless it paid. If Dutch was telling a story of freedom against civilization, Micah was there to turn every sentence into an excuse for blood. Micah's personality was, in the truest sense, a mirror without conscience. He killed easily, robbed recklessly, and treated cruelty as entertainment. When others hesitated, he pressed forward. When others doubted, he laughed. There was none of Hosea's quiet morality in him, none of Arthur's dawning unease, only a predator who had finally found a stage big enough for his ambitions. In a world where the old ways were dying, Micah had no nostalgia, only appetite. What made him dangerous was not just what he did, but what he said. Micah understood Dutch's need to be believed, so he fed it. Around the fire after Blackwater, when the air was thick with unspoken questions, Micah would lean in and praise Dutch's plans as genius, his leadership as unshakable, his vision as the living embodiment of outlaw freedom. If Bill or Javier wondered aloud whether the ferry job had been a mistake, Micah mocked them as cowards. If Arthur voiced concern, Micah branded it ingratitude. Dutch had spent years with Hosea challenging him, Arthur questioning him, John drifting in and out of his orbit. Now, in the ashes of a disaster, here was a man who never pushed back, never asked for proof, never demanded that dreams match reality. Is it any surprise Dutch started listening? Surrounded by tired eyes and hushed doubts, Micah's blind loyalty felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Early on, that loyalty took a sharper form. When Dutch spoke of needing money, Micah pressed for bigger scores, riskier hits, more bodies on the ground. A simple robbery became an ambush. A warning became a provocation. If someone in camp questioned Dutch's temper or his judgment, Micah whispered about disloyalty, about traitors, about snakes in the grass. The philosophy of resistance turned, inch by inch, into a justification for revenge. This was no longer just a story of a leader losing his way. It was the slow fusion of two dangerous men. Dutch needed someone to tell him his lies were truth. Micah needed someone powerful enough to make those lies lethal. Together, they pushed for more violence, more risk, more hardline answers to every perceived slight. And as Dutch reached for anything that might make him feel right again, Micah did something even worse than believe his delusions. He weaponized them. And Dutch, standing on the edge of his own unraveling, began to follow that echo into darker places than the gang had ever imagined. Micah had turned Dutch's pain into ammunition, but pain alone could not hold a gang together. For that, Dutch needed something softer, something brighter. He needed a fresh start. And, in the spring of 1899, he promised one on a green ridge above a little frontier town called Valentine. Horseshoe Overlook felt, at first glance, like salvation. The snow and hunger of Coulter gave way to rolling hills, wildflowers, and a wide sky that seemed to promise freedom again. Below, Valentine buzzed with ranchers, railroad men, drifters, and drunkards. The living embodiment of a frontier town caught between the old ways and the creeping order of civilization. It was close enough for work, far enough to feel hidden. Dutch sold it as exactly what the gang needed. From the very beginning, he framed Horseshoe as a pause, not a retreat. They would lay low, rebuild, gather strength and money before making their great escape west or overseas. One last push, one last score, and then the dream. He told them Blackwater had been an aberration, a wound that would heal if they just stayed calm and moved carefully. The world was changing, he said, but they would adapt on their own terms. Around the campfire, that philosophy sounded almost idealistic again. Children played in the grass, Pearson cooked real meals, Hosea and Dutch spoke in low voices about investments and safer work. To Arthur, exhausted from the mountains, it felt in the truest sense like the gang might find its footing. Wasn't this what they had always wanted, from its humble beginnings? A family together, a little distance from civilization, time to plan a way out? But the disconnect between Dutch's words and his actions showed itself almost immediately. For a man preaching quiet, he had a talent for noise. He approved a high-profile stagecoach robbery right under the nose of the law. He let the boys drink and brawl in Valentine's saloon until Arthur was dragging them out of bar fights. Faces recognized, names remembered. He sanctioned confrontations with O'Driscolls and debtors that left bodies in alleys and questions on every lawman's tongue. Each time, Dutch wrapped the chaos in grand language. A robbery was necessary capital. A public beating was sending a message. A dead man in the mud was self-defense, or unfortunate, but required. The pattern was simple but deadly. Talk of laying low, followed by actions that did the opposite, then a speech to make it all sound planned. Arthur half believed him. He wanted to. He rode the green hills, looked down at Valentine, and tried to trust that Dutch's talk of Tahiti, of Australia, of some distant shore. It was more than a story. Yet he could not ignore how often the so-called plans were improvisations dressed up as strategy, how often Dutch reacted in anger and then claimed design. In Valentine, Dutch's lies still wore hopeful faces. Promises of calm, promises of control, promises of a clear path out of the outlaw world. But the habit was set now. Say one thing, do another, explain it away. And under the bright sky of Horseshoe Overlook, that quiet betrayal of reality began to harden into the gang's new normal, waiting for the next town, the next move, the next escalation. At Horseshoe Overlook, the lie changed shape. The promises of calm and control did not vanish. They were simply boiled down, sharpened into a single, relentless refrain. Dutch began to answer every doubt, every fear, Every question with the same three words: we just need money. It sounded simple. It sounded reasonable. In a world closing in with Pinkertons, telegraphs, railroads, and barbed wire, money could buy passage, papers, property. To a gang that had once believed itself the living embodiment of freedom, it became the new magic key, the last bridge between outlaw dreams and the march of civilization. From its humble beginnings as a practical concern, food, ammunition, horses, that phrase swelled into a philosophy. It was no longer about why the gang robbed. It was about why it had to keep robbing. After Blackwater, Dutch's rhetoric shifted from ideals to arithmetic. Law pressure? We just need money to get far enough away. Internal doubts from Hosea and Arthur? We just need money, and all this will make sense. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and instead of adapting, Dutch treated cash as a cure for history itself. One last score would answer the Pinkertons, erase the ferry disaster, and somehow restore the gang's purity. One last score would turn Saint Denis, Tahiti, and 100 vague promises into something real. But with each new job he greenlit, the contradiction grew louder. The Cornwall train, the Valentine Bank, the Braithwaite and Gray feuds, every opportunity meant more bodies, more witnesses, more heat. Every time Dutch swore that this robbery would buy distance, it actually erased distance, dragging the gang back under the magnifying glass of the modern world. Safety was always on the other side of the next risk. Freedom was always just past the next set of chains. Arthur felt it first as a discomfort, not yet open rebellion. He heard Dutch's words, heard the old music about family and loyalty, but saw the bodies left in muddy streets and burning plantations. He watched Hosea's skepticism harden, watched John pull away toward Abigail and Jack, and began to suspect that there was no coherent plan, no true destination, only forward motion. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, was unfolding in front of him, and he was trapped in the middle of it. In the truest sense, we just need money became a shield. It deflected blame, excused failure, and turned every doubt into disloyalty. Question the plan, and the answer was more dollars. Question the blood, and the answer was more dollars. But beneath that shield, something else was growing. Dutch's addiction to the life, to the rush of command, to the feeling of being the last outlaw general in a war that had already been lost. So a question hangs over Horseshoe Overlook and everything that followed. Did Dutch truly believe that money would save them, or had those three words already become his most convenient lie? The answer Dutch gives that question is Rhodes. On the surface, Rhodes is a sleepy southern town, all whitewashed porches and slow-talking manners. Underneath, it is a powder keg. Two ancient dynasties, the Greys and the Braithwaites, hold the county in a death grip, their feud older than most of the men dying for it. It is a story of pride and decay, of plantations rotting from the inside while the world was changing around them. To Dutch, that makes it perfect. From its humble beginnings, his philosophy had always painted the gang as rebels against a corrupt civilization. Now here stands Lemoyne, the living embodiment of that corruption. Slavers turned gentlemen, criminals turned respectable. When the gang settles at Clemens Point and begins sniffing around Rhodes, Dutch presents it as destiny. These people are parasites, he tells his family. Their war is not the gang's war. Their money, however, is another matter. Dutch's pitch is elegant, almost seductive. They will play both sides, stay above the conflict, and walk away rich while the old ways were dying in the mud. Help the Greys, help the Braithwaites, never fully commit, never truly belong. In the truest sense, he sells it as a clean crime in a dirty world, no innocent blood, only aristocrats bleeding each other dry. What could be more in line with his ideals? But to make that work, Dutch has to start lying in a new way, not just to lawmen or victims, to allies. With the Greys, he sends Arthur and the others in under Hosea's cover as cattle rustlers and hired hands, promising Sheriff Gray that the gang will help restore order, that their loyalty lies with his house. He downplays any connection to the Braithwaites, presents the Vanderlinde Gang as disciplined, reliable, a partner in reclaiming Rhodes from chaos. At the Braithwaite Manor, the tune changes, but the performance is the same. Dutch flatters Catherine Braithwaite, hints that the Greys are weak, that the gang's true sympathies sit with her proud, embattled family. Again he promises discretion, again he promises loyalty, again he hides the truth that, in the end, he plans to rob them both blind. Two families, centuries of hatred, and the same outlaw selling them the same dream. Here the moral slippage becomes impossible to ignore. Dutch tells himself, and his gang, that betraying both sides is justice, that he is striking a blow against a rotten southern aristocracy that built its fortunes on chains and blood. In practice, it is pure opportunism wrapped in rhetoric. The gang is not freeing anyone, it is just taking a cut. Rhodes marks a turning point. From the very beginning, Dutch lied to enemies and lawmen. That was expected. In Rhodes, he proves he will lie just as smoothly to supposed partners, to people who believe they are on his side. The Greys and Braithwaites are not comrades, but they are something new in his story, pieces on a chessboard he intends to sacrifice from the moment he shakes their hands. And once a man learns to see allies as disposable, how long before that gaze turns inward toward his own family? That gaze does not take long to find a target. The first real price of Dutch's Rhodes experiment is paid in blood on a sunny street, in what should have been a simple escort and a bit of theater for the Greys. It becomes, in the truest sense, a public execution. Sean Maguire rides into town loud and laughing, the living embodiment of the gang's younger generation. He is reckless, charming, a born outlaw who still believes Dutch's speeches about freedom and family. The plan is straightforward: walk with the Greys, show the town they are allies, keep the charade intact while Dutch and Hosea maneuver behind the scenes. Then a rifle cracks from a balcony. Sean's skull explodes. He drops without a last word. The ambush is brutal and sudden. For Arthur, for John, for the other younger members, it is a story of how fast the game can turn. One moment, they are playing dutiful partners in a feud they barely understand. The next, they are dragging Sean's body out of the street while Rhodes erupts in gunfire. Dutch's quiet chessboard has announced itself as a battlefield. Dutch's reaction is loud, theatrical, and carefully directed. He rages over Sean's corpse, curses the Greys as treacherous snakes, and swears that the gang will make them pay. He talks about loyalty, about betrayal, about how this proves the world was changing and the old ways were dying. What he does not do is question his own decision to walk his people into the lion's den for the sake of leverage. To Dutch, Sean's death becomes proof not that his philosophy is failing, but that he has been right all along. Civilization is corrupt, the rich families are monsters, and only overwhelming violence can carve out freedom. The solution is not less risk, but more. Not fewer lies, but deeper ones. That lesson turns even darker when the Braithwaites strike back. While the gang plays both sides, burning fields and robbing stagecoaches, the Braithwaites watch, learn, and choose a softer target. Jack Marston, the child raised among outlaws yet shielded from the worst of it, is taken from camp in a moment of terrible quiet. No gunfight, no grandstand. Just a missing boy and a mocking note. In that instant, Dutch's abstract games become personal horror. The family he boasts about has been violated, not by faceless Pinkertons, but by the very elites he thought he could manipulate. How does he frame it? As destiny, as the inevitable cost of standing against a rotten world. He tells Arthur and John that this is war now, that Jack's kidnapping proves they must hit back harder, burn brighter, take one more score to finally break free. Even as a young man lies in the ground and a child is dragged into the crossfire, Dutch's answer does not change. More risk, more revenge, more promises that this time it will all pay off. But the next promise will demand a price even higher than Rhodes, and the next body will not fall in some backwater town. Not this time. Not this time. The next body falls in the city, under electric light, where the whole world can watch. When the gang finally rides into St. Denis, it is not entering another dusty frontier town. It is riding straight into the future. Towering brick factories belch smoke into a gray sky, streetcars rattle past crowds of workers, and lamps flicker to life even before the sun has set. For men used to coyotes howling and river frogs singing, the constant clatter of machines is almost deafening. It is the living embodiment of everything Dutch claims to despise. From its humble beginnings, his philosophy has been built on the promise of freedom beyond the reach of government, banks, and railroads. Yet here, every corner is watched. Every alley feeds into some larger system of money and power. The docks swarm with laborers and lawmen, the mansions of the Garden District glow with obscene wealth, and the poor choke on the runoff of progress. The world was changing, and Saint Denis is where that change feels inescapable. Publicly, Dutch wastes no time declaring his hatred. He calls the city a disease, a monument to greed and corruption, a place where the old ways were dying under brick and steel. Around the campfire at Shady Bell, he paints Saint Denis as a cautionary tale, proof that civilization crushes the spirit and devours the weak. To hear him speak, this is not a city but a machine that turns men into numbers and dreams into debts. But the story does not end with disgust. In the truest sense, Saint Denis also entrances him. Privately, Dutch cannot look away from the scale of it all. Banks larger than anything in Blackwater. Politicians who can be flattered, threatened, or bought. Crime that operates in ledgers and boardrooms rather than back alleys. For a man whose ego has outgrown small-town banks and train cars, is it any surprise that he sees this place as the only stage big enough for his grandest schemes? So he reframes the nightmare as opportunity. To the gang, he sells Saint Denis as the final stepping stone to paradise. One good bank job here, one clever play with men like Angelo Bronte, and all the pain of Coulter, Valentine, and Rhodes will finally pay off. He talks of Tahiti, of mangoes and freedom, of disappearing beyond the map once the city has been bled for every last dollar. Does the danger of operating in the most policed, most watched city they have ever seen come up? Only as proof of how much the score must be worth. And here the pattern reveals itself. For a man who claims to want escape from civilization, Dutch keeps steering his so-called family straight into its heart whenever money glitters on the horizon. The wilderness was supposed to be their salvation. Saint Denis proves it has become only their waiting room. Saint Denis does not greet the gang with open arms. It greets them with Angelo Bronte. If Saint Denis is the living embodiment of Gilded Age power, Bronte is its quiet, velvet-gloved fist. From the very beginning, Dutch paints him as everything his philosophy claims to oppose. Bronte is refined, impeccably dressed, a crime boss who dines with mayors and judges while extorting the poor in the back alleys. He represents organized, civilized crime, the very fusion of outlaw brutality and polite society that Dutch rails against in his campfire speeches. Dutch talks about freedom, about resisting civilization's corrupt institutions. Bronte is those institutions. Wearing cologne and quoting poetry. So why does Dutch walk straight to his door? Because in Dutch's telling, this is a story of necessity, not choice. He tells the gang they need allies in this new world, that the old ways were dying, and Saint Denis requires a different approach. Bronte, he insists, is a temporary evil, a stepping stone toward bigger scores, a man to be used and discarded once the gang has what it needs. Dutch frames it as strategy, not compromise, a short alliance that will open banks, riverboats, and political connections that would otherwise stay closed. To make that lie work, Dutch has to tell a few more. He downplays Bronte's reach, calling him just another crook, as if the man does not own half the city's officials. He insists he can handle him, that they understand each other, because they are both men of vision trapped in a changing world. In Dutch's version, he is the one in control, the puppeteer tugging threads in a foreign city. Bronte's arrogance, his accent, his manners all become props in Dutch's performance, proof that this polished gangster is no real threat to a hardened outlaw family. Reality cuts through that illusion when Bronte betrays them. After the Rhodes disaster, when Jack is taken and the gang is driven to desperation, Dutch turns to Bronte for help finding the boy. Bronte returns Jack, but only on his own terms, parading the child as a trophy at his garden party, humiliating Dutch in front of the city's elite. Then, once the gang has served its purpose, Bronte has them ambushed and Jack snatched again, revealing that Dutch's necessary alliance has placed the gang's youngest member directly in a predator's hands. Dutch knew Bronte was dangerous. He lied about the cost. When Dutch finally drags Bronte from his mansion and drowns him in the bayou, he calls it justice. He tells the gang it was necessity, vengeance for Jack, a blow against the corruption of civilization. But beneath the rhetoric, something uglier shows through. This is not the measured outlaw who once spoke of restraint and principles. This is a man killing out of wounded pride, out of rage that someone else held the leash. In the truest sense, Bronte's death is not a return to Dutch's code, but proof that the code is gone. And if Dutch can twist this killing into a noble act, what else is he willing to justify next? From that moment on, Dutch's favorite word becomes a shield: necessary. Bronte's murder is not just another killing in a violent world. It is a line in the mud of the bayou. where Dutch's philosophy bends to his temper and never quite straightens again. It begins with a rescue that should have been a triumph. Jack is taken from the gang by Bronte's men, a calculated insult that turns Dutch's civilized rival into a personal enemy. The gang stalks through St. Denis in the rain, traces the boy to Bronte's mansion, and finally storms the estate under cover of darkness. For once, the men who usually skulk in alleys and swamps stride through marble halls, guns drawn, dragging Angelo Bronte from his own parlor while the city's elite cower. The power dynamic flips in an instant. The crime lord who paraded Dutch through salons now kneels in his nightshirt, gagged and humiliated, with Dutch Vanderlinde holding the gun. On the surface, it is a story of justice and retrieval, of a family reclaiming one of its own. Underneath, something uglier coils. From the very beginning of this feud, Bronte has mocked Dutch's dreams, exposed his lack of control in St. Denis, and treated him as a useful, theatrical outlaw rather than a revolutionary. When Dutch orders Bronte stuffed into a boat and taken into the bayou, this is not strategy. This is a man taking back his pride. The killing itself is intimate, almost ritualistic. The gang watches as Dutch forces Bronte to kneel at the edge of the murky water, spits back his insults, then shoves his head beneath the surface. There is no quick bullet, no distant rifle shot from the shadows. Dutch holds him there. He listens to the thrashing and the choking, to the gurgled curses in Italian and French, until they fade into bubbles and silence. Even hardened men like Arthur and John are unsettled. This is not the measured outlaw who once lectured them about restraint. This is a man enjoying the power to decide exactly how long another human being suffers. Afterward, Dutch's tongue goes to work where his hands just were. He tells the gang Bronte had to die, that leaving him alive would mean more kidnappings, more betrayals, more threats to their freedom. He insists it sends a message to St. Denis, to civilization itself, that the Vanderlinde Gang will not be toyed with. In the truest sense, he frames the drowning as protection, as loyalty, as a dark but necessary act for the sake of their family. But the truth is simpler and far less noble. Bronte wounded his ego, exposed how small Dutch looked in a city of electric lights and paved streets, and reminded him that the world was changing while his old ways were dying. Killing Bronte is revenge, a desperate attempt to feel powerful again in a universe that keeps telling him he is obsolete. He is not defending his people so much as defending the image of himself as their fearless, infallible leader. From this night on, every time Dutch calls a killing necessary, a question hangs over the campfire. Necessary for the gang's survival, or necessary for Dutch's fragile sense of who he is. And when those two needs finally collide, which one will he choose? That question finally comes to a head in St. Denis, in the marble echo of a city bank that Dutch swears will fix everything. The one last score he has been dangling since Blackwater suddenly has an address, a vault, and a timetable. In his telling, this is not just another robbery. This is deliverance. From its humble beginnings as a ragged campfire dream, the promise has grown with every failure. First it was heading further west, then hiding in the mountains, then slipping across the sea. By St. Denis, Dutch is promising Tahiti, Australia, some distant paradise where civilization cannot reach, and the gang can finally live in the truest sense of freedom. The destination keeps changing, but the story stays the same. One more job, one more miracle, and the family walks away clean. To sell that miracle, Dutch has to smother the fear that hangs over the camp. He insists he has inside information on the bank's routines, the guards, the vault. He claims Angelo Bronte's betrayal has given him insight into the city's rhythms, that the Pinkertons are looking everywhere except the one place he intends to strike. There will be a diversion, a quick entry, a clean escape to the docks, then a ship out of this poisoned world. That is his script. He repeats it until it sounds less like a plan and more like prophecy. But the world was changing, and St. Denis is the living embodiment of that change. Electric lights, telephones, organized law, a city already crawling with agents who know the gang's faces and habits. Arthur sees it. Hosea sees it. Hosea quietly reminds Dutch that this is not some frontier bank in the middle of nowhere. This is the beating heart of modern finance, watched day and night. Arthur, worn down by failures and corpses, asks the question no one wants to voice. What if this is just Blackwater all over again? John, too, is wary. He has a family now, real responsibilities. and the dream of Tahiti sounds more and more like a fairy tale told to restless children. When he hesitates, Dutch does what he has always done when logic fails him. He reaches for emotion, for loyalty, for guilt. Doubt becomes betrayal. Caution becomes cowardice. He invokes the dead. Annabelle, Bessie, Davy, Sean. He reminds them of Colm O'Driscoll, of Cornwall, of every enemy that said the gang would not last. He paints the bank job as a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, stand with him and honor the fallen, or step aside and abandon the only family that ever cared. The women and children, he swears, will be kept safe. This risk is for the men, for the outlaws who still believe. By the time the vault door looms before them, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's lies are about to meet a world that has finally caught up. The St. Denis bank job is not just another heist. It is the moment his philosophy, his pride, and his delusions collide with something that will not bend, modern civilization itself. The vault door opens, but what steps through is not fortune. It is the end of an era. Outside, the St. Denis streets become a stage, and the Pinkertons script a scene designed to break more than a robbery. Hosea is not gunned down in the chaos or lost in some alley. He is captured, paraded, and executed in the square, a calm old outlaw held at gunpoint while the city watches. Milton does not just kill a man. He kills the very beginning of Dutch's dream in front of the modern world. For Dutch, it is a public unmasking. Hosea had been there from its humble beginnings, the partner who tempered Dutch's fire with patience, who turned wild bravado into workable plans. In the truest sense, Hosea was the gang's conscience, the strategist who asked the hard questions and forced Dutch to admit when his own philosophy was drifting into fantasy. Seeing him held helpless, hearing that single gunshot, Dutch's composure shatters in an instant. His reaction is raw and immediate. There is a flash of visible grief, a howl of denial that cuts through the gunfire, but it is swallowed almost at once by rage. Dutch does not freeze and reflect. He lunges for revenge, for motion, for anything that will keep him from standing still with what has just happened. The order is simple and desperate. Keep moving, keep shooting, get out. Any chance to ask what went wrong dies on that street alongside Hosea. Hosea's loss destabilizes more than the plan. It tears out the quiet voice that could challenge Dutch without being branded a traitor. For years, when Dutch lied to himself about one last score, Hosea would nudge him toward smaller risks, smarter exits, some shred of responsibility to the family they had built. When Dutch's pride pushed toward spectacle, Hosea reminded him that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, that survival mattered more than speeches. Now that counterweight is gone. In the aftermath, as the survivors stagger through alleys and across rooftops, Dutch begins to process Hosea's death not as a tragedy to learn from, but as proof of his own worldview. The Pinkertons did not just attack them. In his mind, civilization itself executed his oldest friend. What better evidence, he argues, that this world is irredeemably evil? To the shaken gang, Dutch frames Hosea's execution as justification, not warning. If they can kill Hosea in broad daylight, what choice is there but to strike harder, to take bigger risks? To chase that final escape with even more fury? His promises of Tahiti, of freedom, do not shrink under the weight of loss. They grow louder, more grand, more detached from reality. And here the pattern shifts. From this point on, every lie Dutch tells will be bigger, bolder, more fevered, precisely because the one man who could quietly lean over the campfire and say, "Dutch, this is madness," is no longer there to speak. With Hosea gone, Dutch's voice no longer had a quiet counterweight, and so his grief took the gang not toward safety, but straight into the jaws of madness. The next great plan would not lead them west to freedom or south to Tahiti. It would lead them out onto the water, into the storm, and onto an island that was the living embodiment of every fevered promise turned inside out. The escape from St. Denis is not a clean break from civilization, but a chaotic flight from a world that has finally caught up. The bank is in ruins, Hosea and Lenny are dead, Pinkertons swarm the streets, and Dutch, cornered and desperate, seizes on a boat as if it were destiny itself. The gang clambers aboard under gunfire, wounded, scattered, half-mad with shock. Dutch calls it salvation. The ocean calls it something else. The storm that follows feels, in the truest sense, like judgment. Waves smash the boat to splinters, men are thrown into black water, and the carefully spun story of one last score dissolves into raw survival. When Arthur and the others finally wash ashore on Guarma, they are not stepping onto a promised paradise. They are stranded, starving, far from home, with no money, no allies, and no idea where in the world they have landed. From the very beginning on that beach, Dutch refuses to see disaster. He frames Guarma as a temporary setback, another test of loyalty, another chapter in a story of persecution and eventual triumph. He tells Arthur and the survivors that once they get off this island, the plan is still alive, Tahiti is still waiting, the dream is merely delayed. The old ways were dying, he insists, but their philosophy is eternal. Reality answers with bullets and fever. The gang is dragged into a brutal local conflict between the tyrannical sugar baron Fussar and the rebels trying to overthrow him. Dutch starts making promises to rebels he barely understands, trading future help and imaginary resources for guns, passage, leverage. Men are exhausted, sick from the climate and from grief, fighting on behalf of strangers while their own family falls apart an ocean away. What plan could possibly survive this? Here, Dutch's detachment from the world hardens into something almost religious. He speaks of fate, of destiny, of how every hardship proves that they are chosen outlaws standing against a corrupt civilization. Each reckless decision is wrapped in grand language. Each needless risk is painted as necessary sacrifice. He bargains with lives he cannot afford to lose, and every failure is blamed on betrayal, never on his own delusions. By the time they finally claw their way off Guarma, Dutch's lies have evolved. They are no longer just about money, or Tahiti, or one last job. They are about reality itself, about who he is and what the gang means in a world that is closing in. And as they sail back toward America, toward Beaver Hollow and the end, one question hangs over the shattered remnants of his family. If Dutch can bend the truth this far, how much further is he willing to go? When the ship finally scrapes back against American wood and stone, it feels less like a homecoming and more like a haunting. The gang that steps off that boat is not the same one that rode into St. Denis in swagger and color. It is smaller, limping, sunburned, and hollow-eyed, carrying Guarma's ghosts into a world that has already moved on. The familiar landscapes of Lemoyne and the Heartlands should feel comforting. They do not. Every tree line looks like an ambush, every town a trap. Hosea and Lenny are gone, Sean is dead, the women are shaken, and the Pinkertons are closer than ever. The gang's numbers have thinned, their money is gone, and their reputation has curdled from daring outlaws into hunted animals. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying. What once felt like a story of freedom now feels like a slow march toward extinction. Dutch, however, walks off that ship as if returning from a brief inconvenience. He speaks quickly, confidently, filling the air before anyone else can. Guarma was a setback, not a failure. The plan still stands. They just need money. One last score, one last push, and then Tahiti, or Australia, or somewhere beyond the reach of civilization. His words flow with the same rhythm heard since the very beginning, the same polished philosophy about family, loyalty, and resistance to a rigged system. On the surface, nothing has changed. In truth, everything has. Arthur listens, but the sound has turned. The phrases he once took as gospel now ring thin, almost rehearsed. When Dutch says, "Trust me," Arthur hears the St. Denis bank, hears Hosea's last breath, hears the gunfire on Guarma's beach. When Dutch insists that killing Cornwall and Bronto was necessary, Arthur hears pride and rage, not strategy. The cracks are no longer hairline. They are canyons. Micah steps into that widening space like he has been waiting for it his entire life. He reinforces every word Dutch says, nodding, grinning, calling anyone who hesitates a coward or a traitor. When someone wonders if the gang should lay low, Micah mocks them. When Arthur questions another dangerous job, Micah is there first, whispering that Arthur has gone soft, that he no longer believes in the dream. Two men trying to rob the same future, each claiming to be the living embodiment of Dutch's ideals, but only one of them still has Dutch's ear. From its humble beginnings, this gang survived by trusting that Dutch's plans, however reckless, were grounded in something real. Now, those plans feel improvised, reactive, driven less by an idealistic vision and more by fear of irrelevance. Is this still a fight for freedom, or just a refusal to admit defeat? In the truest sense, Dutch's lies begin to turn inward, away from the Pinkertons and the rich and corrupt, and toward Arthur, John, and the very family that built his legend. Dutch is back. But the man who returned from Guarma is a stranger, and his next betrayals will not just break the gang. They will redefine what betrayal means. Dutch returns from Guarma insisting the dream still lives, but the world was changing, and the first real crack in that dream doesn't come from a Pinkerton bullet or a botched robbery. It comes from a cough, a simple, nagging cough that Arthur keeps brushing off as camp dust and bad tobacco, until it drops him to his knees in the street. Blood on his hand and strangers staring. The doctor's office is quiet, almost insultingly ordinary for a death sentence. No gunfight, no posse, no grand last stand. Just a tired physician in Saint Denis, listening to Arthur's chest, asking about his work, his diet, his past. Then the verdict: tuberculosis. Advanced, irreversible, months, maybe, not years. For a man who has spent his life outrunning consequences, the realization lands harder than any lawman's fist. His time is limited, which means the time to fix things is limited too. From that moment, Arthur's story becomes a story of acceleration. The same world he has always ridden through suddenly looks different. Faces stand out more sharply. Cruelty cuts deeper. Small acts of kindness matter in a way they never did when he believed there would always be another camp, another state, another chance. Illness, in the truest sense, becomes his brutal teacher. With death riding beside him, he grows less willing to swallow Dutch's comforting lies about Tahiti, about one last score, about freedom just over the horizon. Dutch, however, does not want a dying man. He wants a loyal soldier. When Arthur tries to speak about his condition, Dutch offers platitudes and distraction. Rest up, son, after the next job. Doctors are pessimists. We just need money. Each new cough is answered not with concern, but with another plan, another robbery, another speech about civilization closing in and the old ways were dying. Arthur's mortality becomes an inconvenience, something to be managed, not mourned. As Arthur's body weakens, his moral vision sharpens. He sees the orphan children, the frightened townsfolk, the broken people trailing in the gang's wake. He begins to help those Dutch would have dismissed, to question violence that used to be automatic. The living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy starts drifting away from it, becoming more compassionate, more self-aware, less willing to hide behind rhetoric about family and rebellion. At the same time, Dutch moves in the opposite direction, growing more paranoid, more self-justifying, more willing to sacrifice anyone who threatens the story he tells himself. Their paths cross in every campfire conversation. Arthur coughs, questions, doubts, Dutch deflects, rants, commands. One man is facing the end and trying to make peace with the damage he has done. The other is facing the end and refusing to admit it exists at all. Which one is truly sick? Here, the pattern reverses from its humble beginnings. For years, Arthur was the blunt instrument, and Dutch the conscience. Now, Arthur's failing body becomes the mirror that finally reflects Dutch's failing soul. And Dutch does not like what he sees. So he does what he has always done with inconvenient truths. He looks away, and he reaches for another lie. Arthur's illness exposes Dutch's decay. John's imprisonment exposes his priorities. If Arthur's coughing fits are a mirror, then John shackled on Sisika is the test. The test of what Dutch's philosophy ever meant in the first place. John's capture is not a grand stand for freedom or a noble last ride. It is a botched robbery on the way out of Saint Denis, a desperate attempt to salvage something from the ruins of Hosea and Lenny's deaths. In the chaos after the bank, the gang scatters under Pinkerton gunfire. The old ways were dying right there in the streets, and John gets thrown from his horse and seized by the law. One son left bleeding in the mud, the other dragged off in chains, and Dutch forced to flee with whoever can still ride. Back in camp, the story Dutch tells is not a story of failure. To Abigail, to Jack, to the remnants of the gang, he insists John will be rescued. No one gets left behind. Family comes first. He repeats the phrases that once defined him. The living embodiment of that idealistic creed he preached from its humble beginnings. He puts a hand on Abigail's shoulder, promises that this is temporary, that John is strong, that they will ride for Sisika when the time is right. The words are familiar, comforting hollow, because the time is never right. Days turn to weeks, and every time Arthur presses him, Dutch produces a new reason to wait. They need more money. They need better information. The Pinkertons are too close. The gang is too weak. Civilization is closing in from every side. Each excuse sounds reasonable in isolation, but together they form a pattern that Arthur cannot ignore. How many plans end with someone loyal left in a cell or a grave? As Micah's voice grows louder around the fire, Dutch's delays grow longer. Micah whispers about John being reckless, about him talking to the wrong people, about liabilities and informants. The same man who once dragged a teenage John out of a hanging now nods along as his new favorite questions John's loyalty. The betrayal is not open yet, not in the truest sense, but it is there in the way Dutch's eyes slide away whenever Abigail begs for action. Arthur feels the shift. He rides with Dutch on jobs that are supposedly for John's sake, only to watch the money vanish into another doomed scheme. He listens to Dutch invoke family while refusing the one act that would prove it. Is Dutch protecting the gang, or protecting himself from the risk of failing on Sisika's walls? The question gnaws at Arthur as his own body fails him. When Dutch finally agrees to go after John, the timing says everything. The camp is fracturing, Arthur is questioning him openly, and Dutch needs a gesture, a spectacle, a reminder that he still lives by the code he quotes. The Sisika raid becomes less a rescue and more a performance. But on that island, under those prison guns, the truth about Dutch's motives will be impossible to outrun. And once John is free, the next lie will have nowhere left to hide. John comes back from Sisika in chains and bruises, but the deeper damage is invisible. The rescue that should have healed the gang instead exposes the fracture lines. Dutch rides home with his prize, yet every mile back to Beaver Hollow tightens the knot of suspicion in his chest. A story of loyalty and betrayal is about to turn inward. From the very beginning, Dutch had demanded questions, debate, philosophy around the campfire. Now, when Arthur and John question him, the reaction is different. Arthur presses him about Colm's hanging, about Bronte's murder, about the bodies piling up for a dream of Tahiti that never gets closer. John, fresh from prison, asks why his family was left behind, why Abigail had to beg and fight for someone to go after him. Abigail herself stands in front of Dutch, voice shaking with fury, demanding action, demanding honesty. Into that tension walks Micah Bell, the living embodiment of Dutch's worst impulses, wrapped in a flattering smile. He leans in close, mutters that Arthur has been talking to the Pinkertons, that John has gone soft, that Abigail is poisoning them against their leader. Micah turns ordinary concern into whispered betrayal, and Dutch, already wounded in his pride, chooses to listen. So Dutch reframes everything. Concern becomes ingratitude, doubt becomes cowardice, honest questions become treachery. Around the camp he repeats the same line, anyone who questions him is undermining the family. When Arthur reminds him that Hosea would have handled things differently, Dutch cuts him off, insisting Hosea always believed in the plan. When John argues that they should run, Dutch calls it fear, weakness, proof that prison broke him. The gaslighting grows more precise, more cruel. Dutch denies promising that Saint Denis would be the last big job, insists he only said it would help their future. He claims he never guaranteed Blackwater was safe, only that it was necessary. When Arthur recalls Dutch swearing no more innocence, Dutch snaps that Arthur is misremembering, that the world was changing and a man must adapt. The old ways were dying, he says, and anyone clinging to them is dragging the gang down. Moments that once defined their bond are twisted. Dutch tells Arthur that he never called him son to keep him in line, that Arthur only heard what he wanted to hear. He suggests John has always been half out the door, that his supposed loyalty was an act. In the truest sense, Dutch starts rewriting the entire story of their family to cast himself as the only constant, the only victim. The emotional cost is brutal. Arthur, the enforcer who believed in the philosophy, finds himself pushed to the margins, treated as a problem to be managed instead of a partner. John, who once tried to be Dutch's heir, is painted as a deserter. A man who chose Abigail and Jack over the gang. Both are forced into an impossible choice: betray their conscience or betray the man who raised them from lost soul to outlaw. And beneath it all, Dutch's greatest lie is no longer about money or freedom or Tahiti. It is about who the real traitors are. That lie will not just break the gang against the outside pressure of civilization. It will tear them apart from the inside, and the next confrontation will make that impossible to ignore. Dutch's greatest lie has a name, and it is not Micah, or Blackwater, or even one last score. It is Tahiti. The island begins as a passing thought, a hazy promise of warmth and distance, and ends as the living embodiment of his delusions, a dream that becomes a cage for everyone who believes him. From the very beginning of 1899, Dutch talks about getting away. First, it is somewhere warm, somewhere far from the noose of civilization closing around them. As the noose tightens, that vague horizon hardens into a map. Tahiti, a tropical island, a mango plantation, a little piece of paradise where they will drink coffee on the veranda and live off the land. Each failure adds another detail. Each dead friend adds another fantasy of calm seas and clean slates. On the surface, it sounds almost humble. Not thrones, not empires, just a farm and some freedom. But Tahiti is never just a place. In Dutch's story, it is absolution. The promise that all the blood spilled from its humble beginnings in the 1870s to the alleys of Saint Denis will somehow be washed away by salt water and sun. It is a world where Hosea is not dead, where Jack never gets kidnapped, where the old ways were dying but the gang slipped away before the end. In the truest sense, Tahiti is not geography. It is a theology. Psychologically, Dutch needs that theology more than anyone else in the camp. Every robbery, every corpse, every betrayal of his own philosophy demands an answer. Tahiti becomes that answer. Why rob Cornwall again after Guarma? Tahiti, why trust Micah's reckless leads? Tahiti, why keep pushing Arthur and John when both are broken and done? Because the island is always one ship, one bank, one train away. And whenever someone questions him, Tahiti slams down like a gavel. Hosea wonders if they are chasing ghosts in Saint Denis. Dutch talks about the tropical sun. Arthur asks what the plan really is. Dutch repeats that they just need money for the boat. John, desperate to leave with Abigail and Jack, is told to hold on, to show loyalty, because the family will be together on that distant shore. Criticism is not answered, it is postponed. Doubt is not engaged, it is exiled to the imaginary plantation. At first, Arthur smiles when Dutch paints that picture. Around the fire at Horseshoe Overlook, the idea of palm trees and easy days feels like a story of hope, a reward for years of riding and bleeding. But as the bodies pile up, the phrase Tahiti changes timbre. By Beaver Hollow, Arthur hears it as a hollow refrain, a broken record Dutch spins whenever reality gets too loud. The more detailed the fantasy becomes, the more obvious it is that there is no real plan to reach it. So a question hangs over every mention of the island. Did Dutch ever truly intend to go there? Or was Tahiti only ever a story he told himself, a final illusion that the lost soul who led an outlaw family could still outrun the world that was changing around him? Tahiti was a dream. Cornwall was a target. In Dutch's mind, both became part of the same grand story of resistance, a story of freedom against a world that was changing faster than his philosophy could keep up. Leviticus Cornwall enters the tale as the living embodiment of the new America, railroads that cut through mountains, oil derricks that scar the plains, and hired guns who answer to ledgers instead of honor. From the very beginning, Cornwall does not see an outlaw family with ideals. He sees a nuisance, a cost of doing business, a problem to be erased. His trains, his refineries, his investments stretch across the map, and to a man like that, the Vanderlinde Gang is not an enemy to respect, but a line item to eliminate. Dutch, of course, refuses to be a line item. He escalates. He robs Cornwall's trains, hits his oil wagons, humiliates his guards. Each job is sold to the gang as necessity. The money is needed for Tahiti, for a new life, for one last score that will let them outrun civilization. But each strike also feeds something else in Dutch, something harsher. The feud stops being about survival and becomes a crusade. A personal war against the industrial tyrant he blames for everything wrong in the world. In Dutch's speeches, Cornwall is no longer just a railroad baron. He is capitalism itself, the face of the civilization that is closing in. The old ways were dying, and Dutch tells his people that every dynamited bridge, every derailed train, is an act of rebellion in the truest sense. Robbing Cornwall is not theft, he insists, but justice. It sounds righteous, it feels righteous, but the noose tightens a little more every time. That tension finally snaps in Annisburg. Cornered by debt, pride, and Pinkertons, Cornwall arrives with his agents to crush the gang once and for all. Dutch does not parley, he ambushes. From the shadows, with Arthur and the others watching, Dutch steps out and executes Leviticus Cornwall in cold blood, a bullet through the chest delivered with a sermon about oppression and greed. To hear Dutch tell it, a tyrant has fallen, and the world is a little freer. The reality is far colder. Cornwall's death does not free the miners of Annisburg, does not slow the trains, does not weaken the companies that own half the frontier. It brings more Pinkertons, more soldiers, more pressure. The gang is forced to flee again, poorer than before, buried under heat they can never shake. Dutch calls it necessary. The consequences say otherwise. From its humble beginnings, the gang killed to eat, to escape, to protect its own. Now, more and more, the people who have to die are simply the ones who make Dutch feel small, cornered, or powerless. If Cornwall, with all his railroads and oil, can be gunned down and turned into another speech, who will Dutch decide is necessary next? If Cornwall's death shows how far Dutch will go to protect his pride, his treatment of Abigail and Jack shows how little he will risk to protect his so-called family. This is where the rhetoric of loyalty, sacrifice, and freedom collides with the reality of a frightened woman and a kidnapped child, and the impact is devastating. From the very beginning of the Roads chapter, Abigail's world is narrowed to one thing, Jack. The boy is small, curious, the living embodiment of the gang's promise that this outlaw story might lead to something better. When the Braithwaites snatch him away, Abigail's desperation tears through the camp. She begs Dutch to do something, to put every man on finding Jack instead of chasing more money or prestige. Her voice is not political, not philosophical. It is the voice of a mother who has nothing left to lose. Dutch answers with all the right words. He talks about Jack as our boy, about family, about how they will burn the South to the ground if they have to. He rides on Braithwaite Manor with righteous fury, and for one brief moment it seems as if his ideals and his actions are aligned. But even here, there is a crack. Dutch is as interested in humiliating the Braithwaites and proving his philosophy as he is in rescuing the child. The raid is spectacle as much as salvation. When Jack is finally recovered from Angelo Bronte in Saint Denis, Abigail wants what any parent in that collapsing world would want: distance from danger, a chance for her son to breathe. She pleads for Dutch to slow down, to think, to stop dragging John into every mad scheme. Dutch, again, says all the right things. He promises that Tahiti will fix everything. That one last job will buy Jack a future beyond the reach of civilization's chains. But each time a choice appears between the dream and the boy, the dream wins. He drags John onto the trolley station attack, leaving Abigail and Jack exposed in a city crawling with law. He dismisses her fears as hysteria, her demands as ingratitude. In Dutch's campfire speeches, every member is equal, every voice matters, every life is worth dying for. In practice, Abigail is a problem to be managed, Jack a symbol to be invoked when the gang needs reminding of what they are supposedly fighting for. The betrayals accumulate. Dutch leaves John to rot after the Saint Denis bank disaster, insisting that the gang cannot risk a rescue. Abigail begs him to reconsider, to remember the boy who keeps asking where his father is. Dutch counters with abstractions, the plan, the money, the future. He will die for his people in theory. In reality, he will not even delay a robbery for them. And that is the cruelest lie of all. For Abigail and Jack, Dutch's greatest betrayal is not the fantasy of Tahiti or the endless one last score. It is the slow, undeniable realization that, in the truest sense, they were never his priority at all. For Arthur, that slow realization about Abigail and Jack is not an isolated cruelty. It is the final thread in a pattern that can no longer be ignored. Dutch's promises have gone from grand and idealistic to small, hollow, and deadly. And the man who once preached freedom and family now chooses his own ego over the lives he swore to protect. The first real fracture comes on the mountain above Coulter, when John is dragged in half-frozen and torn apart by wolves. Dutch talks about him as if he is already gone, a failed son who wandered too far. Later, in the chaos after Saint Denis, that callousness becomes policy. Dutch leaves John behind during the escape, dismissing him as dead weight, a traitor, a man who never had the heart. For Arthur, who remembers the very beginning, when Dutch held John up as the future, This is not just a tactical decision, it is betrayal written in plain language. From there, each choice cuts deeper. At Beaver Hollow, Dutch dismisses the suffering of the Wapiti, using their desperation as camouflage for his own war with Cornwall and the Pinkertons. Innocent families are driven from their land, children starve, elders are gunned down, and Dutch calls it necessary. The philosophy that once targeted the rich and corrupt now tramples anyone unlucky enough to stand in the way. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch responded not with adaptation, but with delusions of grandeur and rivers of blood. Arthur's internal struggle is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a son watching his father become a stranger. For years, Dutch was the living embodiment of purpose in a lawless world. Arthur believed in the speeches, in the code, in the promise that they were more than common outlaws. Now, he watches Dutch side with Micah at every turn, taking the word of a latecomer and probable informant over the man who has ridden with him since boyhood. How many times can a man be called son while being treated as expendable? Quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, Arthur's allegiance shifts. He starts hiding money for John and Abigail, pressing them to leave while there is still time. He warns Sadie, Charles, and others when Dutch's plans grow suicidal, steering them away from the worst dangers. In the truest sense, he begins protecting the gang from Dutch, rather than protecting Dutch from the world. The campfire conversations change too, where once he defended Dutch without question, now he answers with silence, with doubt, with hard, tired eyes. The confrontation that follows is not a single shouting match, but a series of collisions. On the cliffside above Beaver Hollow, in the mines, in the standoff with Micah, Arthur forces Dutch to hear the truth he refuses to see. He calls out the lies about Tahiti, about John, about Micah's loyalty. He demands to know when killing for survival became killing for pride, when protecting the family became sacrificing it to an endless plan. Does Dutch still believe his own words, or is he simply afraid to admit they died long ago? Dutch's response is to double down, to retreat into his own narrative where betrayal comes from everyone but himself. Yet Arthur's final acts of rebellion are not driven by revenge. They are an attempt to reclaim the ideals Dutch once preached, to give John, Abigail, and Jack the freedom Dutch only talked about. In his last days, sick and hunted, Arthur becomes what Dutch pretended to be from its humble beginnings, a man willing to lose everything so that others might have a chance at a different life. And that is the pattern interrupt in this collapsing world of outlaws and civilization. As Dutch clings to a dying dream, Arthur quietly lives it, one hard choice at a time. But Dutch is not interested in hard choices. He is interested in one last miracle. From the very beginning of Beaver Hollow, the promise hangs over the camp like smoke. One final train, one final payroll, one final act of defiance that will buy the gang its freedom. Dutch speaks of it as destiny, not desperation. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and he insists this is their chance to slip through civilization's fingers before the door slams shut forever. He lays it out in grand, sweeping terms. A heavily guarded train or government payroll, timed just right, struck with such force that the Pinkertons will be left chasing ghosts. The money, he swears, will be enough for Tahiti, for Australia, for ranches and orchards and quiet lives on distant shores. It is a story of escape and redemption, of family saved at the last possible second. He tells them they have learned from Blackwater, from Rhodes, from St. Denis. No more mistakes, no more half measures. This time, in the truest sense, they will be ready. But under the speeches, there is almost nothing. No clear route out once the job is done, no safe houses, no concrete plan for moving a mountain of cash through a country that already has their faces on wanted posters. Dutch talks about blowing the tracks, about hitting the guards hard, about riding fast and trusting in their courage. He does not talk about food, or fresh horses, or how to outrun telegraphs and rail schedules in a modern world that moves faster than any outlaw. His philosophy has shrunk to bravado and gunpowder. The camp hears him, but it does not hear him as one voice. Bill and Javier still nod along, clinging to the familiar rhythm of Dutch's rhetoric, mistaking volume for certainty. Micah feeds it, calling anyone who doubts a coward or a traitor the living embodiment of Dutch's worst paranoia. Some go along out of habit, some out of fear, some because they have nowhere else to go. Loyalty has become inertia. Arthur and John see something different. They see the missing details, the way Dutch's eyes slide past questions, the way every objection is answered with the same empty refrain, have a little faith. How many times has that faith led them straight into a noose? How many bodies has this dream already buried in unmarked ground? By the time the last meeting breaks, the decision is made. They will ride. One more train, one more payroll, one more chance to prove Dutch right, or finally expose him as wrong. As the gang mounts up and the forest thins into rail line and open sky, the words "one last score" echo through the night, stripped of all romance. They have never sounded emptier. They have never been more dangerous. Because this time, when the shooting starts, it will not just be the law aiming at Dutch's dream. The bullets on the rail line are only half the danger. The real shot that kills the gang is fired in the dark, in a tent at Beaver Hollow, in whispered conversations and convenient disappearances. While Dutch thunders about freedom and civilization, Micah Bell is quietly selling that dream to the highest bidder. From the very beginning at Beaver Hollow, the pattern is there. Micah is gone when the Pinkertons hit, then reappears with uncanny knowledge of where the law is weakest. He pushes the St. Denis Bank, survives Guarma unscathed, and somehow every disaster seems to fall on someone else's head. He walks away richer, closer to Dutch, the living embodiment of survival at any cost. When Milton corners Arthur on the hillside and calmly reveals that Micah has been feeding them information, it does not feel like a twist. It feels like confirmation. Arthur has already been watching. So has Charles. So has Sadie. They notice that whenever the gang moves camp, the law is never far behind, as if civilization itself is tracking them through the trees. They remember Micah's mysterious time in jail near Strawberry, how he came back with stories that never quite added up. They hear his late-night talks with Dutch, how he always knows which train is loaded, which town is weak, which patrols are thin. How could an outlaw, cut off and on the run, be so well informed? Piece by piece, a story of betrayal forms. Arthur overhears snatches of conversation, sees Micah slipping away from camp, returning with smug confidence and fresh information. John feels the noose tightening around his own neck, his family threatened again and again while Micah's schemes get priority. Someone is talking. Someone inside. The old ways were dying, and the gang's code of loyalty is bleeding out from the inside. When Arthur finally confronts Dutch, the response is not relief or grim understanding. It is fury. Dutch refuses to see Micah as the traitor, refuses to admit that the man who flatters him endlessly might be the one selling him out. Instead, he turns on Arthur and John. He accuses them of jealousy, of weakness, of losing faith in the philosophy that made them a family. In Dutch's mind, it is not Micah who has changed. It is everyone else who has abandoned the dream. Why does Dutch cling so hard to Micah? In a world where every idealistic promise has turned to ash, Micah still tells him he is right. He never questions, never doubts, never asks Dutch to look in the mirror. He offers easy answers and easier targets. If things go wrong, it is Arthur's fault for doubting, John's fault for wanting out, Hosea's fault for being too cautious. Micah gives Dutch a scapegoat for every failure and a cheering section for every delusion. In the truest sense, Dutch is choosing more than a side. He is choosing a version of himself. By believing Micah's lies over Arthur's truth, he embraces a world where he is still the visionary and everyone else is expendable. The tragedy is simple and devastating. To protect his ego, Dutch sacrifices the family he spent his life claiming to protect. And once that choice is made, what chance does the gang have left when the next lie comes calling? Once Dutch chooses Micah's version of events over Arthur's, the camp does not simply fall apart, it detonates. The dream that began as a story of freedom and family tears itself in half, and every quiet doubt that had been whispered around the fire turns into shouted accusations with pistols drawn. Beaver Hollow becomes a battlefield in the truest sense. On one side stand Arthur, John, Sadie, and those who still believe the gang was meant to be more than a pack of scavengers. On the other stand Micah and his followers, men who have decided that survival and spoils matter more than any old philosophy. Between them, trying to pretend he is above it all, stands Dutch, the living embodiment of a leader who cannot admit he has lost control. As the Pinkertons close in, and the world was changing faster than any of them can understand, Arthur and John focus on a single, simple goal: get Abigail and Jack out. While Dutch mutters about one last score and Micah hisses about rats and traitors, they are dragging a wounded outlaw family toward a future beyond the gun. The irony is brutal. The men branded as outlaws are the only ones still trying to protect the innocent. The escape fractures the gang completely. Bill and Javier, still clinging to Dutch's legend from its humble beginnings, fall in with Micah's rage. Charles and Sadie peel away to fight their own battles. Arthur rides toward the mountains, already dying, lungs burning. Every breath a reminder that time has run out not just for him, but for the old ways that Dutch refuses to let go. On that cold, high ridge, everything finally collides. Arthur and Micah crash together in a desperate, vicious fight, two versions of Dutch's legacy clawing at each other in the dust and snow. One is the boy Dutch raised to read, to think, to believe in something beyond greed. The other is the man Dutch has come to favor, a mirror of his worst impulses, driven by paranoia, cruelty, and the promise of easy money. Which son represents the real Dutch now? Dutch stands over them, gun in hand, coat whipping in the wind, watching as if this were some abstract debate rather than a mortal struggle. His silence is a choice. By refusing to pull Micah off Arthur, by refusing to acknowledge the years of loyalty Arthur has given him, he lets Micah's accusations become the truth. Neutrality becomes its own quiet betrayal. Arthur begs him to see. Micah spits venom, demanding Dutch finish it. For a heartbeat, the old Dutch flickers, the man who once swore no one in his family would be left behind. Then it dies. He holsters his gun. He turns away. When Dutch walks off that mountain, he is not only abandoning a dying man, he is walking away from the last honest mirror of who he used to be. The question is, what happens to a leader once that mirror is gone? Arthur's death is not just the end of a man. It is the moment Dutch's words finally run out of road. On that ridge above the world, Arthur Morgan is a ruin of the outlaw he once was. His lungs are failing, his body is broken, his face is a map of bruises and blood. Tuberculosis has been eating him from the inside. Micah's fists and bullets have done the rest. He drags himself to the edge, watching either the soft blaze of sunrise over the valley or the black wall of storm clouds rolling in, depending on the player's choices. In both cases, the message is the same. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying. In those final moments, Arthur does not talk about Tahiti or Australia or one last score. He spends his last strength forcing John to run, to ride, to get back to Abigail and Jack. He presses money into John's hands, covers his escape, and begs him to do better, to build a real life beyond the gun. A story of freedom and family, of dreams and delusions, suddenly narrows down to one desperate plea: save them. Go, the irony is brutal. In the truest sense, Arthur dies living the philosophy Dutch once claimed as his own. He sacrifices himself for his family. He refuses to abandon the vulnerable. He chooses loyalty over survival, not to an idea of Dutch, but to the people Dutch has failed. Arthur becomes the living embodiment of the gang's idealistic beginning from its humble beginnings, even as Dutch himself has long since betrayed that beginning in practice. And Dutch is not there to see it. He does not stay to hold Arthur's hand, to hear his last confession, to answer for what he has done. He walks away, leaving the man who believed in him most to die alone on a rock, or surrounded by enemies who once called him brother. For a leader who spent decades preaching that no one gets left behind, that absence is louder than any speech he ever gave. What does it say when the man who talked most about loyalty cannot face the consequence of his own betrayal? Symbolically, this is the collision Dutch cannot dodge. His story about himself, hero, father, visionary outlaw resisting civilization, meets the undeniable truth of his actions. Arthur's body on that mountain is the bill come due for every lie about plans, about freedom, about family. No clever turn of phrase can hide that Dutch's choices killed the son who tried hardest to believe in him. Here the pattern breaks. Dutch, the man who romanticizes death and destiny, never receives a grand, noble end in this story. That honor belongs to Arthur. Dutch lives on in the shadows, a wandering lost soul clinging to a broken myth, while the man he failed dies with clarity, purpose, and a kind of peace. The contrast speaks louder than Dutch ever could, and it will haunt everything that comes next. Arthur's death leaves a silence Dutch cannot fill, And into that silence rides the one thing philosophy cannot swallow: John Marston refusing to die on schedule. As the gang fractures at Beaver Hollow, the story of destiny and noble sacrifice Dutch keeps preaching is interrupted by something far messier, far more dangerous to his myth: a man who walks away. John's escape begins in chaos. Pinkerton's closing in, Micah screaming for blood, Dutch raving about loyalty while abandoning the very people who built his dream. In the dust and gunfire on that final ridge, Arthur buys time with his life, forcing Dutch and Micah to back away and giving John a narrow path out. What follows is not a triumphant ride into the sunset, but a desperate flight through the mountains. Abigail and Jack clinging to a future that barely exists, John carrying the weight of every betrayal on his shoulders. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang promised freedom, family, and a way to live outside civilization's grip. Dutch insisted there was no real way out, only the doomed honor of dying as an outlaw rather than rotting in a cell. Yet John proves, in the truest sense, that this was always a lie. He does the one thing Dutch swore could not be done. He leaves. He survives. He starts over. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and John chooses to change with it instead of being buried beneath Dutch's delusions. The cost, however, is carved into him. Scars from wolves, bullets and chains mark his body. The memory of Arthur's rasping warnings marks his conscience. John cannot unlearn Dutch's philosophy, but he can see where it led: to Hosea's corpse on a St. Denis street, to Lenny bleeding on a rooftop, to Arthur coughing his life away in the mud. In his new life on Beecher's Hope, every fence post and plowed field is haunted by voices from the past, by dreams of Tahiti, and promises of one last score that never ended. And this is where Dutch truly loses control of the story. He cannot kill John on that mountain. He cannot silence the man who knows every lie from the very beginning. While Dutch drifts through the West as a wandering lost soul, clinging to the ruins of his outlaw legend, John becomes the living embodiment of its contradiction: a former Vanderlinde gunman raising cattle, teaching his son, trying to live honestly under the very civilization Dutch claimed was unlivable. What does it mean when the disciple disproves the master's gospel simply by waking up every morning? That tension sets the stage for their final meeting. When John tracks Dutch down years later in Red Dead Redemption, it is not just a man hunting an old mentor for revenge. It is the inevitable collision between a fantasy and the one truth Dutch could never bury under speeches. The proof, standing in front of him with a badge in his pocket and a family to protect, that Dutch was wrong about how this story had to end. Dutch's disappearance is, in the truest sense, an epilogue written in shadows. The gang dies loud under gunfire and thunder, but Dutch fades in a quieter way, swallowed by the same wilderness he once claimed to understand better than the men in suits. After Beaver Hollow, after the mountains and the betrayals, the stories splinter into rumor. Some say he headed north, into country so cold and high that only the most stubborn outlaw or most desperate lost soul would stay there. Others whisper he drifted through border towns under false names, an aging drifter who paid in gold coins no one had seen minted in years. A few insist he lived alone in some forgotten cabin, talking to no one, trusting no one, watching the world he hated grow railroads and telegraph lines across the horizon. The world was changing, and Dutch, the living embodiment of resistance to that change, chose to vanish rather than bend. How does a man like that survive being wrong? For Dutch, survival means doubling down. If the gang is gone, if Arthur is dead, if John has walked away, then the problem cannot be Dutch. So the story in his head shifts. From its humble beginnings, the gang becomes grander, more noble, more persecuted. Every robbery was a protest, every murder a tragic necessity, every betrayal something done to him, never by him. In his mind, he is once again the tragic hero on a stage too small to hold his philosophy. There is a bitter irony here. The man who once commanded an entire camp, who could turn a firelit night into a sermon about freedom and civilization, ends up with no congregation at all. No Hosea to question him, no Arthur to believe in him, no John to crave his approval. Just Dutch in his speeches, echoing off rock walls or cabin rafters, with no one left to nod along. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, reduced to a monologue no one hears. And yet, when he finally resurfaces in Red Dead Redemption, it is clear that the years have not stripped the rhetoric away. The old ways were dying. But Dutch still dresses his violence in the language of ideals. Surrounded now by disillusioned revolutionaries and doomed followers, he repeats the same lines about government, control, and freedom, even as every viewer knows what those words cost Arthur and John. His philosophy has curdled, his charisma thinned, yet the pattern is unmistakable. Different gang. Same speeches. Less soul. So when John Marston finally tracks him to that icy cliff, it is not merely a reunion between two gunslingers from another age. It is the moment Dutch's private myth collides with the one man who remembers the truth. The question is no longer who can draw faster. The question is whether a lifetime of lies can survive a single, final look in the mirror. That answer comes with Dutch's last step into the void. That answer is written on that frozen ridge in the mountains, years after the gang's ashes had blown across the frontier. Dutch Vanderlinde stands there as both relic and warning, the living embodiment of a story that refused to admit it was over, by the time John Marston finds him in Red Dead Redemption. Dutch has done something grimly impressive. He has rebuilt the past. New faces replace old ones, a fresh gang in the mountains and canyons of the West, but the pattern is identical. He steals, he preaches, he promises freedom from civilization's noose, he rails against the government and the encroaching order, even as he kidnaps and terrorizes the very people he claims to be freeing. It is the gang's history replayed in miniature, from its humble beginnings to its bloody habits, only meaner, smaller, and stripped of the idealistic veneer Hosea once helped provide. In that final stand, Dutch's philosophy has hardened into fatalism. Surrounded by government agents, hunted by John, he talks not of Tahiti or grand dreams, but of inevitability. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. Men like him, he insists, cannot exist in this new age of railroads, telegraphs, and ledgers. He frames himself as a doomed outlaw prophet, a man who saw the truth of the system and refused to bend. Is that courage, or is it the last desperate mask of a man who spent a lifetime running from accountability? Dutch's words on that cliff are carefully chosen. He tells John that the government will never stop, that civilization will grind down every outlaw, every tribe, every soul that does not submit. He claims resistance is futile, that the story of men like them can only end one way. In the truest sense, he tries to turn his own failure into a grand thesis about the whole world, folding personal cowardice into a sweeping philosophy of betrayal and decline. Then comes the final gesture. Surrounded, gun drawn, Dutch does not surrender. He does not let Ross slap irons on his wrists and drag him into a courtroom where witnesses, records, and questions might peel back the layers of his legend. He steps backward off the cliff. One short motion. A long fall. To Dutch, it is one last act of control, a refusal to let the system write the final chapter of his story. Symbolically, that choice is perfect for him and damning at the same time. Even in death, Dutch insists on directing the scene, on choosing the angle, on deciding where the curtain drops. No trial, no testimony, no public airing of how many times he lied about one last score or a better life. No chance for John to force him, under oath, to admit what he did to Arthur, to Hosea, to the family he claimed to love. And here is the pattern interrupt. That final leap feels defiant, but it is also the ultimate escape. Dutch dies as he lived, clinging to his own myth, spared from ever having to say the simplest, most dangerous words a man like him could utter, that he was wrong. And that is the point where the myth shatters. Because once the dust settles on Dutch's final fall, what remains is not one mistake, but a story of lies laid end to end, from its humble beginnings to its bloody conclusion. The first lies are the most seductive. From the very beginning, Dutch tells his people they are the good kind of outlaws, striking blows against a corrupt civilization instead of preying on the innocent. He calls them a family, not a gang, insisting that loyalty will keep them safe in a world that wants them dead. He swears they are different from the men they rob and the men they kill, that their crimes are acts of philosophy rather than greed. Those promises become the living embodiment of their identity, the creed repeated around campfires until no one remembers how fragile it really is. Then come the operational lies, the ones that keep the machine running. Blackwater is sold as an easy job, a clean ferry robbery that will set everyone up for life, even as warnings pile up and Hosea hesitates. Rhodes is presented as a harmless game between feuding families, a clever con with no real cost, right up until Sean lies dead in the street and Jack is stolen away. St. Denis is framed as the path to freedom, a single grand bank heist that will buy Tahiti, Australia, some distant shore where the law cannot reach. Guarma is brushed off as a temporary setback, a strange detour in a foreign world, when in truth it is the moment Dutch abandons restraint and embraces chaos. Beneath those public deceptions run the personal lies that cut the deepest. To Arthur, Dutch promises purpose, that he is the favored son, the right hand, the man who will carry the dream forward. To John, he insists there is a place in the family, even as he punishes every attempt at change and resents every step toward Abigail and Jack. To Abigail and that boy, he vows safety, swearing that the camp is a shield against a hostile world while dragging them from gunfight to gunfight. To Hosea, he keeps repeating that there is a real exit plan, that one last score will finally allow them to retire, even when no such plan exists beyond the next robbery. By the end, the lies shrink with the world around him. Dutch says they just need money, as if piles of bills could turn back time when the old ways were dying all around them. He repeats, "I have a plan," until the words are empty air, a ritual performed to silence doubt. He calls Micah loyal, trusting the newest vulture over the oldest friends, and then accuses Arthur, John, and the others of betrayal, turning his own failures into their alleged treason. In the truest sense, his universe collapses inward until only his ego feels real. So the question lingers over the ruins of that camp. Which lie hurts the most? The promise of freedom that never came, the family that was never truly safe, or the claim that they were better than the world they helped destroy? In the next part, each answer will reveal something about Dutch, about the gang that followed him, and about an American frontier that was already dying long before the last shot was fired. The ruins of Beaver Hollow are not just the end of a gang. They are the end of a story that America has been telling itself since the very beginning. Dutch's dream was never purely his own invention. It was plugged directly into the great American myth that freedom is always just over the next hill, that a man can start over if he is brave enough, ruthless enough, willing enough to cut ties with civilization and ride towards some untouched horizon. In that sense, the Vanderlinde Gang is not just an outlaw band. It is the living embodiment of a national fantasy. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's philosophy sounds familiar. Stand against corrupt power, protect the weak, live free of government chains. The gang talks about loyalty, about family, about giving lost souls a place to belong. That rhetoric echoes the founding ideals of liberty and equality, the promise that anyone can claim a piece of the world through courage and hard work. But just as the country's founding story hides conquest and blood, Dutch's campfire speeches hide robbery, kidnapping, and murder. The gang mirrors the country that hunts it. Both claim high ideals, both insist they are different from common criminals, both draw a line between us and them, and then move that line whenever it becomes inconvenient. Dutch says they rob only the rich and corrupt, yet they terrorize Valentine, fuel the Rhodes feud, and leave bodies in St. Denis. America proclaims freedom, yet builds that freedom on stolen land, exploited labor, and laws written to protect the powerful. A story of liberty and equality, of dreams and delusions, of rebellion and control. But the world was changing. The old ways were dying under iron rails and telegraph wires. Railroads stitched the map together, oil barons and industrialists reshaped the economy, and federal law rides in with Pinkertons and marshals who answer to distant offices, not local codes of honor. Modernization does not just chase the gang, it exposes them. Against factories, banks, and corporations, their romantic outlaw image looks less heroic and more pathetic, a band of armed drifters insisting they are the future while camping in the shadow of smokestacks. Here lies the deeper cruelty. Dutch's lies are only exaggerated versions of the lies civilization tells itself. He claims some people deserve wealth, that others are parasites or criminals, that violence is justified if it serves progress or protects the chosen family. Nations say the same about expansion, about who belongs inside their borders, about which wars are necessary. When Dutch insists that killing Cornwall or Bronte is a tragic necessity, it echoes every official speech that turns greed and revenge into policy. So understanding Dutch is not about forgiving him or turning him into a misunderstood hero. It is about seeing how easily noble language can hide ugly truths, how quickly a philosophy of freedom becomes an excuse for domination. If a single outlaw can wrap brutality in poetry, what happens when entire governments do the same? Those lies do not end with Dutch's disappearance into the mountains. They echo forward through the two men who knew him best, turning the collapse of the gang into a story of inheritance, of what survives when a philosophy dies. For Arthur, that inheritance is written on paper and carved into conscience. His legacy is internal. From the very beginning, Dutch taught him to read, to think, to see the world as a rigged game where only the brave and the clever could ever taste freedom. By the end, Arthur is using those same lessons to dismantle Dutch's delusions. His journal becomes the quiet counter-argument to every grand speech, recording not just events but doubt, remorse, and a changing perspective that Dutch never allows himself to admit. Arthur's last months are a slow, painful revision of the dream. He still believes in protecting the weak, in standing by family, in resisting a civilization built on exploitation, yet he can no longer pretend that Dutch's one last job will fix anything. So he carries only the best fragments forward. Courage becomes sacrifice, not bravado. Loyalty becomes honesty, not blind obedience. Defiance of injustice becomes shielding John, Abigail, and Jack from the very violence Dutch insists is necessary. In the truest sense, Arthur tries to live Dutch's ideals more faithfully than Dutch ever does, by refusing to keep lying about what they have become. John's legacy, in contrast, is hammered into fence posts and nailed onto a ranch house door. Where Arthur leaves words, John leaves walls, fields, and a family name that is not constantly on the run. Dutch once promised islands in Tahiti. John settles for a patch of hard land and a mortgage under the government's eye. It is almost ironic. The man raised to be an outlaw becomes the living embodiment of the small, respectable life Dutch mocked as a cage. Yet that quiet life is not a betrayal of the old gang. It is an answer to Dutch's biggest lie. John proves that protecting family does not require an endless trail of bodies, that survival does not demand another bank, another train, another doomed escape from a world that was changing whether they wanted it to or not. The old ways were dying. But John shows they can be buried with a shovel instead of a gun. Both men selectively inherit Dutch's teachings. They keep the fire and discard the smoke. They remember the speeches about standing up to men like Cornwall, about refusing to kneel before a cold mechanical civilization, but they reject the ego that turned every setback into an excuse for more blood. They carry the dream of freedom without the delusions that destroyed the gang from its humble beginnings to its bitter end. So who truly carries Dutch's legacy? The dying outlaw who writes his confession in a journal, or the ex-gunman who builds a home on haunted ground? And what does it mean that Dutch's proudest ideals only make sense once they are lived without him? Dutch's story lingers because it refuses to be simple. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a man who could inspire devotion with a speech and destroy a family with a decision. From the very beginning, Dutch is framed not as a cartoon villain or spotless hero, but as something far more unsettling, a leader whose brilliance and monstrosity grow from the same wounded place. He is charismatic, intelligent, genuinely idealistic at times. Dutch reads books, quotes philosophy, talks about freedom and civilization as if conducting a sermon under the open sky. Around a campfire, he is the living embodiment of hope for people who have nothing. Yet the same tongue that promises Tahiti, Australia, or a quiet ranch in the West also sells Blackwater as a clean job, Saint Denis as a necessary risk, Guarma as a temporary detour. His gift for language becomes a weapon. The man who preaches family becomes the man who abandons John on the rooftops and leaves Arthur bleeding in the mud. The games invite empathy without absolution. Dutch is seen through Arthur's weary eyes and John's haunted memories, through the perspectives of men who loved him as a father and watched him come apart. The charm is undeniable. The way he rescues a lost soul from the streets, the way he stands up to Cornwall's bullying, the way he seems to understand that the world was changing and the old ways were dying. But each promise of one last score cuts deeper. Each corpse left in the wake of his plans makes that charm feel thinner, more desperate, more hollow. Part of his power lies in how recognizable his flaws are. Dutch fears irrelevance as civilization closes in. He cannot admit mistakes. Blackwater is never his fault. Hosea's death is never the cost of his arrogance. Micah's poison is never his own weakness. Rather than face painful truths, he clings to comforting stories about destiny, betrayal, and a final payday that will fix everything. Who has not seen a leader, a friend group, a family, cling to a narrative long after reality has left it behind? In this world, Dutch's gang becomes a mirror for movements held together by words that no longer match the facts. Speaking up, as Arthur does, risks exile and death. Staying silent, as Javier and Bill do, buys temporary belonging at the price of complicity. It is a story of people trapped between freedom and loyalty, between the philosophy they were promised and the brutality they are ordered to commit. Here is the pattern interrupt. Dutch's shadow endures, because it does not only raise questions about an outlaw in a dying West, it whispers a quieter question. Where, in some corner of life, might there be a one last job lie still being believed? A failing plan, a broken dream, a leader past saving, that looks a little too familiar? Because this is not only a story of Dutch's descent, it is also a story of how different hearts, in different moments, finally let go of the man at the center of the fire. From its humble beginnings around quiet campfires to the chaos of Saint Denis and the snow-choked ridges of the mountains, every player traces the same path, yet carries away a different wound. Some remember the warmth of those early speeches at Horseshoe Overlook, when Dutch spoke of freedom, family, and a future beyond the reach of civilization. Others remember only the echo, when the words were the same but the eyes were colder, and the gun in his hand did most of the talking. So the question hangs over the whole saga: at what point did belief die? Was it back at Blackwater, in the moment the easy ferry job turned into a massacre and Dutch shot a woman in the face, then convinced the gang it had been necessary? For some, that single act is the fracture line, the instant when the philosophy of robbing the corrupt to protect the weak collapsed into something uglier, something no longer idealistic in the truest sense. For others, the breaking point comes later, under the bright electric lights of Saint Denis. Hosea executed in the square, Lenny gunned down on the rooftops, Dutch still insisting that there is a plan, that one more score will make the blood worth it. Or perhaps it is Angelo Bronte's murder, the host turned hostage, dragged from his bed and drowned in the bayou while Dutch rants about respect. In that grotesque baptism, many see the last trace of the man Hosea once trusted wash away. There are those who hold on even through Guarma, through starvation and fever and the hollow promises of Tahiti. For them, the true betrayal is quieter. Dutch leaving Arthur on the mountain, walking away while Micah spits poison, or turning on John outside Beaver Hollow, calling a loyal son a traitor because the truth has become unbearable. Others point to smaller moments, almost hidden in the noise. Dutch dismissing Abigail's fear, threatening her, using Jack's safety as leverage, proving that the family was always conditional. Each of these moments invites reflection, comparison, even a strange kind of confession. Which lie shattered the illusion most? Was it Tahiti, repeated until it became a cruel joke? Was it the way Micah, the living embodiment of everything Dutch once claimed to hate, slid effortlessly into the place Arthur and Hosea used to stand? Or was it simply the realization, somewhere on that final snowy climb, that the old ways were dying, and Dutch would rather drag everyone into the grave than face a world that no longer worshipped his voice? Because where belief finally breaks says something important. It reveals which values in this world of outlaws and encroaching civilization matter most: mercy or loyalty, freedom or stability, family or truth. And as the gang's trail winds toward its final gunshots, that personal breaking point becomes the lens through which the entire tragedy is remembered. Those breaking points are where the next part of this story truly begins. Because once Dutch's voice stops being a prophecy and becomes just another man's excuse, every member of the Vanderlinde family has to decide what freedom, loyalty, and truth actually mean. One path forward is to follow that decision character by character, watching how the same lie hits different hearts. Bill Williamson, who builds his entire fragile pride on Dutch's praise, clings to the dream long after it has curdled, becoming the living embodiment of blind loyalty turned into cornered violence. Javier Escuela, idealistic and romantic, hears Dutch's philosophy as revolution rather than robbery, and spends years trying to pretend the betrayal never happened. Sadie Adler, forged in grief and gunfire, listens to Dutch's promises, measures them against the bodies on the ground, and quietly chooses her own war instead. Even Abigail Roberts, who has heard it all from the very beginning, stops treating Dutch's speeches as salvation and starts treating them as a threat to her son. Another path is to narrow the focus to Arthur Morgan alone, tracing how a true believer becomes a quiet rebel. From its humble beginnings in his early journal entries, the gang is painted as a rough but righteous family, an outlaw answer to a corrupt civilization. Then the tone shifts. After Blackwater, after Rhodes, after Guarma, the handwriting turns heavier, the sentences more doubtful, the sketches darker around the edges. Each small choice, helping a stranger instead of shaking them down, questioning Micah's information, confronting Dutch about Bronte and Cornwall, marks a step away from delusion and toward painful clarity. In the truest sense, Arthur's arc is a story of a man trying to salvage a soul from the wreckage of a dying dream. There is also the long shadow of John Marston, the reluctant outlaw who becomes a reluctant family man. A dedicated episode can follow him from the days when Dutch calls him son to the years when that same name is a curse whispered in government offices. Dutch's influence haunts John across both games, in the way he tries to build a ranch as if it were a lawful camp, in the way he repeats Dutch's lines about doing one last job even as he hates himself for it, in the way his final stand at Beecher's Hope feels like a twisted echo of Dutch on that cliff. How many of Dutch's lies does John end up telling himself? Beyond the people, there are eras begging to be unpicked. The poisonous politics of Rhodes and the Grey Braithwaite feud, where Dutch plays gentleman revolutionary while the world was changing around him. The nightmare of Guarma, that fever dream island where every promise of Tahiti is exposed as fantasy. The early, pre-game years of Dutch and Hosea. Two conmen in a world where the old ways were dying, building a philosophy out of charm, theft, and shared loneliness. Which of those worlds deserves to be dragged into the light first? Because the closer the lens gets, the clearer the pattern becomes. Each member's story refracts the same lies in a different color, until Dutch's grand philosophy is stripped down to the choices, the gunshots, and the graves it leaves behind. And somewhere in those details, hidden between a boast in camp and a body on the dirt, waits the one lie that even Dutch could not outrun. In the end, Dutch's lies do not vanish with the gang's last campfire. They linger in the air of that world, in the ruined dreams of those who survived, in the arguments that still rage over whether he was always a fraud or a believer who lost himself. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, does not close when the credits roll. It echoes. From its humble beginnings, with two conmen testing each other's pockets, to a broken leader staring down at a cliffside grave, the Vanderlinde Gang forms a single, unbroken line of cause and consequence. This channel exists to follow that line. Every camp move, every one last score, every half-truth told in the name of freedom is part of a much larger story, stretching from the very beginning in the 1870s to the last gunshots of the early 1900s, as the old ways were dying under the weight of civilization. The mission here is simple in words and difficult in practice, to tell the entire lore of this world with the same care given to Dutch's every lie in this episode. Long-form breakdowns that trace the gang from Blackwater to Beaver Hollow. Shorter character spotlights that linger on a single lost soul, whether it is Bill hiding fear behind bluster or Javier choosing survival over loyalty. Timeline dissections that take familiar missions and reframe them as fragments of a larger myth, where a quiet ride to Valentine or a tense meeting in Rhodes becomes the living embodiment of a philosophy coming apart. If any part of Dutch's rise and fall struck a nerve, that emotion is the map forward. Did the promise of Tahiti feel tragic? Did Hosea's quiet doubts ring truer than Dutch's speeches? Did Arthur's final attempts at honesty feel, in the truest sense, like a man clawing his way back to himself? Those threads lead directly into the rest of the gang's intertwined tragedies and small redemptions, and each deserves its own firelight and its own time. The practical path is clear. Subscribe to stay with this story as it unfolds, strike the notification bell so each new chapter arrives the moment it is ready, and share this tale with anyone still arguing over Dutch's nature. Was he always a liar using philosophy as a mask, or did the world changing around him twist belief into delusion, freedom into paranoia? Because this is not just a story of one outlaw. It is a story of a whole fading era, struggling between idealism and reality, between family and betrayal, between freedom and civilization. Stories like Dutch's only stay alive when people keep retelling, re-examining, and arguing over them around a shared campfire. So let the next camp be here, in every discussion, every theory, every retold scene. The fire is lit, step closer and keep the story burning.